that call for global coordinated actions, T20 has become ever more important. And now, to begin this session, I would like to invite the lead co-chair of the T20 Indonesia, Professor Bambang Brojonegoro, to give his remark. Professor Bambang Brojonegoro currently serves as the President Commissioner of Telkom Indonesia and Bukalapak.com, two main leading companies in technology in Indonesia. Moreover, Prof. Bambang is also appointed as the Chairman of the Economic Empowerment Agency, Indonesia Chamber of Commerce, or Kadin. For more than 10 years, Prof. Bambang was appointed as the Minister of Finance, Minister of Development Planning, and Minister of Finance, respectively. He served within 3 cabinets of Indonesia Presidency, and Prof. Bambang earned a PhD from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and currently is a professor of economics at the University of Indonesia. So without further ado, Prof. Bambang Brojonegoro, pleased to have you this evening. The screen is yours.
Very good evening for participants in Indonesia, and also good morning, good afternoon for participants across the globe. First of all, I would like to greet Ibu Mari Eka Pangestu, Managing Director of Development Policy and Partnership, World Bank Group, Dr. Hatip Basri, Co-Chair of Task Force 7 of Think 20 Indonesia, former Finance Minister of Indonesia, distinguished panelists, Professor Jeffrey Frankel from Harvard University, Mr. Montek Aluwalia, member of World Bank IMF High-Level Advisory Group on Climate Change, Professor Iwon Aziz, Professor of Emerging Markets at Cornell University, Mr. Rajiv Batra, Southeast Asia and Emerging Markets Equity Strategist, JP Morgan, Ms. Fiona Stewart, Lead Financial Sector Specialist, Finance Competitiveness and Innovation of World Bank Group, Ibu Nurdiana Darus, Deputy Chair of B20 Indonesia, and Bapak Agus Sari, CEO of Landscape Indonesia. Distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, net zero emission, balance between emission produced by human activity and emission reduction have become a key goal of climate action. The world exalts this goal through the 2015 Paris Agreement. In this agreement, hundreds of countries agree to pursue a roadmap to reach net zero emission by 2050. In that roadmap, governments commit themselves to transition into clean energy, close quickly the energy gap, increase inclusion in the energy sector, and mobilize financing and innovation towards energy efficiency and developing alternatives. A combination of those efforts would hopefully create a sustainable condition to fulfill the world's energy needs. The International Energy Agency, or IEA, has highlighted some key milestones to reach net zero emission, which require socioeconomic transformation in generating and using energy. The IEA predicts that wind and solar will become the 2 primary sources of renewable energy should we commit to reaching net zero, meaning that the world should phase out all coal power plants by 2040. Furthermore, a majority of our buildings need a revamp to become energy efficient. Global car sales need to be 60% electric by 2030 and 50% of heavy truck sales by 2035. On paper, these sets of agenda looks innocuous. However, if they are not pursued carefully, this could potentially leave many countries behind. On one hand, not doing enough increases climate risks. This would have a worse impact on southern countries, which already have to overcome many more challenges and crises, including the impact of climate change, food scarcity, wars, refugee situation, etc. Climate change also contributes to increased migration, conflict, and military confrontation, thus leading to more socio-political problems. On the other hand, a sole focus on cutting emissions would inflame transition risks. Cutting emissions abruptly entails risks for developing countries, whose economies rely heavily on carbon-intensive sectors. Fossil fuel, for instance, is regularly used to satisfy domestic demand for energy and provide national income through the margin obtained from sales. The reliance is also present in agriculture and industry to produce intermediate and final products. Such dependence on fossil fuels makes it much harder for developing countries to transition towards greener energy. One may think of cutting subsidies for fuel and electricity as a solution to accelerate the energy transition. However, the pandemic has taught us that certain types of non-renewable energy, such as oil and natural gas, are still needed, and aggressively moving away from brown energy may prove to be double-edged. In the grand scheme of things, the stark contrast on how developing and developed nations view the climate issue could not be more different. While the major powers have started to look at the issue from a visionary point of view, economic minnows still largely treat the climate issue as a luxury good given their current battles with issues of, for example, basic infrastructure, poverty, healthcare, and energy subsidy. An aggressive climate transition plan, which requires cutting energy subsidies, could potentially hurt millions and result in people falling back into poverty as well as widen inequality. These nations, therefore, need time to readjust their transition strategy. Even if such an aggressive plan doesn't bring negative consequences, non-renewable energy still reigns supreme in our world today. Take a look at our efforts against the pervading virus, wherein the aviation and shipping industry has played a crucial role in distributing vaccines around the world, and they are still heavily dependent on non-renewables. The pandemic has also taught us that inability to satisfy a demand shock with supply reinforcement will result in an extreme situation. Without pretense, our current state of green energy is not in a well-prepared state to provide a sufficient energy supply, let alone satisfy a sudden demand shock. As a result, the non-renewables would probably remain that way in the foreseeable future. Therefore, cutting investment and subsidies in these crucial commodities abruptly would ultimately raise energy prices for the developing world and lead to even more burning of other dirtier non-renewables. According to the UNFCCC, 125 trillion US dollar of climate-related investment is needed to achieve net zero emission by 2050. Not only that, but there is also work to be done, as the world must triple the current investment level in the coming 3 years to stay on track. This is an equivalent of 32 trillion US dollar annual investment in 6 key sectors, accounting for a third of the world's 2021 GDP. Additionally, the gap of financing capacity of green economy between developing countries and developed countries is too wide. Developing countries' economic capacity is naturally lower than that of their developed counterparts. It's not surprising that they possess smaller fiscal and monetary capacity. The pandemic has further taken up the space and made the climate transition action more fraught with consequences. Many lower and middle-income countries, despite their commitment towards decarbonization, often find themselves constrained by their limited fiscal space and binding external financing constraints. Even before COVID, large-scale decarbonization effort in lower and middle-income countries oftentimes mean sacrificing other budgetary items that are essential to long-term economic development agenda, such as basic infrastructure, school, and hospitals. COVID-19 further exacerbated the fiscal constraint faced by the lower and middle-income countries, as these countries now have to prioritize short-term economic recovery over financing longer-term development projects or decarbonization. In addition, their domestic financial markets are not sufficiently deep to raise enough amount for full-scale decarbonization effort in the face of ongoing revenue shortfall. Financing climate-related projects in these countries does require the capital from international investors. Leaving low and middle-income countries shouldering the full cost of climate change mitigation and adaptation are not only unfeasible given their fiscal constraint, but also unfair. This stems from the fact that the benefit from addressing climate change will bring common benefit to every country collectively, but the economic costs are asymmetrical and skewed towards developing countries on relative terms. Low and middle income countries in general faces a higher cost of capital, both financial and economic, and diverting the resources that can instead be used for other long-term economic development needs means that the opportunity costs for climate mitigation projects in developing countries are also higher than in developed countries. Mobilizing funds from developed countries into developing for climate-related projects at a low cost is therefore critical to achieve the common goal of 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial level as mandated by IPCC. At the same time, the unprecedented fiscal deficit due to the ongoing recovery efforts from COVID-19 pandemic have put additional strains on many developed countries' fiscal position and preclude a large-scale intergovernmental transfer in the short to medium run. The relatively limited fiscal space due to increasing debt to GDP ratio and existing domestic political constraints means that the feasible amount that can be allocated through conventional financing instruments such as government-to-government soft loans and or direct aids will be short of the amount needed to meaningfully assist developing countries in their transition to net zero economy. There is also a stark contrast between countries in the northern and southern hemisphere in terms of financial power, as proxied by the depth of the financial market. Developing countries tend to possess shallow financial market as opposed to more developed countries. According to IMF, only 36 countries have a financial markets debt index of more than 0.5. The list is dominated by Western household names, rich Middle Eastern nations, as well as Asian economic powerhouses. Thus far, the potential of asymmetrical outcome among types of countries has not been adequately addressed in global leader forum. The common but differentiated responsibilities have been widely known in regard to accommodating provisions for developing countries. One question, however, is still lingering. Is it enough? So far, these kind of initiatives are still lacking concrete, actionable, and binding plans on global leaders forum, such as G20 and COP26. It's becoming more critical to change before it's too late. G20 members have an important role and unique role in pushing forward the agenda of climate transition, especially in integrating the perspective and needs of developing countries toward the current established plans. Considering its influence and leadership role, one of the actions that could be taken by the G20 members is to increase the climate transition capital base through multilateral development banks, for instance. Multilateral development banks have taken commitments to increase the share of their lending that is geared towards climate change. For example, the World Bank Group has committed to fully align its portfolio with the Paris Agreement goals by 2025. MDBs have also instituted policies that limit financing to coal and increasingly away from natural gas as well. The commitment is to change the composition of finance is a major step forward. However, it's not enough. Given that existing commitment of developed countries to mobilize $100 billion has not yet been met, there is a need to identify how climate finance can be scaled up in the most efficient manner as soon as possible. Analytical work show that MDB financing can be attractive to high-emitting developing countries, which face higher cost of capital in the international markets compared to MDB rates. Apart from increasing paid in capital, MDBs must also use the financial headroom that they already have to increase their lending. The Addis Ababa Action Agenda called on MDBs to make optimal use of their resources and balance sheets. Existing research shows how the methodology used by credit rating agencies to evaluate financial soundness of MDBs has caused a chilling effect whereby MDBs reduce their financial exposure more than needed. One of the reasons is because MDBs are prone to pro-cyclical lending. Given the imperative to rebuild from the COVID-19 pandemic in a climate resilient and clean manner, the need for MDBs to lend counter-cyclically is all the more salient. Increasing paid in capital will help to relieve some of this pressure because MDBs will have more equity to support greater investment. However, even more lending could be untapped if MDB make greater use of the financial headroom that they actually already have. The G20 members need to use their engagement with the MDBs to increase paid-in capital to allow for MDBs to increase the total size of their lending, use their voice on the boards of MDBs to make use of the headroom that the banks have to increase lending, and mandate to MDBs to explore wider range of instruments that accelerate deployment of finance while preserving host country ownership. The G20 can send a clear signal to the MDBs about their willingness to increase capitalization as well as their support for making use of the financial headroom that MDBs already have. The G20 commissioned a review of the capital adequacy framework of the multilateral development banks in 2021. MDBs have taken steps to align their portfolio with low carbon pathways. The capital expenditure entailed by such a shift needs attention. Along with capital adequacy frameworks, the G20 can play an important role in improving the accountability of the MDBs on the goals that they have set. The G20 can also help improve the operational barriers that exist within the MDBs that may be constraining scale-up action on climate change. Furthermore, addressing the financial and non-financial barriers to scale up clean energy is also an important issue to be focused on by the G20 members. G20 members and major global institutions have to pay closer attention to the barriers standing in the way of mobilizing finance for renewable energy and energy storage. This institution will have to incorporate barrier analysis in their work to help host countries expand their clean energy portfolios. Barrier analysis will also include the hurdles standing in the way of the institution supporting a phase down of coal. A focus on financial barriers alone is not sufficient. Global institutions and host countries also need to pay due attention to regulatory and governance barriers that may be impeding the scaling up of clean energy. Removing non-financial barriers is where global institutions can also play a significant role in the context of major developing countries. Support of international parties could be tailored towards helping countries tackle those barriers through instruments such as policy-based lending. A focus on non-financial barriers calls for more attention to a larger set of instruments that G20 member states should use to deploy clean energy. Thank you very much. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Please enjoy the webinar.
Okay, thank you, Professor Brojonegoro, for sharing your valuable insight. We will now proceed to the next session of our event, Conversation with Mariel Capanestu. This session will last about 45 minutes and will be moderated by T20 Task Force of International Finance and Economic Recovery Lead Chair, Dr. Hati Basri. I would like to invite Dr. Hati Basri to the stage. Dr. Basri is a former Minister of Finance of Indonesia. Previously, he was the chairman of the Indonesian Investment Coordinating Board. His expertise is in international trade, macroeconomics, and political economy, among others. He was a Center Senior Fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School, Harvard University, Pacific Leadership Fellow at the Center on Global Transformation, University of California at San Diego, and TUC Professor of International Economic Relations, RSIS, and TU Singapore. He was also a T. Kian Wee Distinguished Visiting Professor, National University. Dr. Basri is the chairman of the PT Bank Mandiri and chairman of the PT Excel Asiata. He teaches at the Department of Economics, University of Indonesia, and co-founded Greco Research Institute, a Jakarta-based economic consulting firm, in 2010. Dr. Basri is also a member of the World Bank Advisory Council on Gender and Development. He was a member of the Asia Pacific Regional Advisory Group of the International Monetary Fund and was a member of the High-Level Trade Expert Group co-chaired by Jadis Bakwati and Peter Sutherland. So that's just a short list of what Dr. Hati Basri has done and is currently doing. With that introduction, I would like to hand the stage over to Dr. Basri. Pak Dede, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Rifki. A very good morning, good evening, good afternoon for all the distinguished participants around the world. It is a very fortunate this evening in Jakarta time that we have a very distinguished speaker with us, Managing Director of World Bank, Dr. Mari Elka Pangestu, former Minister of Trade, former Minister of Tourism and Creative Industry of Indonesia, and then one of the most important qualification is my former teacher at the University of Indonesia. And thank you very much for your time, Ibu Mari. Let's we start our conversation this evening. I think Professor Bambang Brojonegoro has laid out a very good ground for our discussion. Yeah, and I would like to add, perhaps we are probably in the very complex situation nowadays. Most of the countries now are transitioning from the so-called the pandemic towards the endemic, but at the same time, you know, we also look at the impact of this war between Russia and Ukraine, and then created a lot of issues related to the energy prices, food prices, and somehow also have an impact on the speed of the energy transition in various countries. And even in some countries, there is a tendency that because the fossil fuel price is so expensive, tend to, you know, move into the using the coal again. Yeah, so this is a very complex situation. At the same time, as Professor Bambang Brojonegoro mentioned, developing countries, developing economies, lower middle income countries has a lot of problems related to the issue of the financing. Yeah, we will discuss about this issue later on, but let me start our conversation. I understand that a couple months ago, the World Bank, the IMF, and also LSE established the so-called the high-level advisory group on sustainable and growth recovery. Yeah, perhaps I will start our conversation if you can share with us about this group and what will be the objective. Then, you know, we can look at the agenda and what will be the relevance to the developing countries and the G20. Ibu Mary, if you can share with us.
Yeah, thanks, Dede. Thanks for the introduction, and congratulations to T20 for this very important event, in the sense that this is one of the top of mind topics that we are all grappling with, in the sense that we know we're dealing with multiple crises. The pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic crisis is still with us. We're still dealing with it. Then we have the conflict or the war in Russia, which is leading to very high prices in food and fuel, and lower growth projections, including the possibility of recession. And then finally, we're still living with the climate crisis, right? And this has raised concerns about how much can we still focus on what we know is the climate crisis. I think Bambang laid it out very well, that it is urgent. We are beyond the tipping points, and it will hurt development. You know, I think prior to the creation of the high-level advisory group, the World Bank had come up with the framing of climate and development. And I think one thing that has happened, and that's why the topic of our discussion is so important, is that I think even for developing countries, they don't no longer see climate and development as trade-offs, I hope, but they see that climate hurts development. It has hurt development, especially for the poorest and most vulnerable countries, and the poorest and most vulnerable in the countries, right? And I think Bambang had laid that out very well. And that's why you need to have moving forward, you need to have a framework that integrates climate and development. So climate hurts development, but if you develop business as usual, it's going to hurt climate and then hit back at development again, right? So I think this is very important, because the framing of this integration and how countries need to face the trade-offs in a fiscally constrained situation, the trade-offs between the priorities of choosing the investments that are needed for climate. But so therefore, what we are doing, Bambang mentioned, we have ramped up our climate financing to 35% of our financing, which is around 26 billion in the last fiscal year. But that's very small if you compare to the trillions of the scale that's needed, right? But we do more than just financing. We help countries to frame so that they can prioritize and figure out the trade-offs between climate and development. So you have to prioritize the areas where it would have the most impact for climate, development, jobs, better productivity because you have cleaner air, et cetera, et cetera. You have to lay that out. And that is, I think, one of the big recommendations of the high-level advisory group, which was created between the World Bank, IMF, and experts from around the world, including yourself, by the way, with Nick Stern, of course, our climate economy guru from a long time ago. And I think the main argument here is that to have developing countries be able to achieve the scale of investments that's needed is the new growth story of the 21st century, because you need the investments to grow, but you want to also do it in a way which is going to give you the climate, the reduction in the CO2 emission, and therefore have very much a big development impact across the board. So that's kind of the big picture of the objective of the task force. And really, we focused on energy transition. Why? Because it is the biggest contributor to CO2 emission is coming from energy sector. And it does turn out that the large emitters are both advanced countries, but also a large group of middle income countries. And at the same time, you are still addressing energy access in the poorest countries. You have like 760 million people who don't have electricity. You have about 1 billion people who don't have access to reliable electricity. And even in a country like Indonesia, while Java, Bali, you may have accessibility, but if you talk about a remote island in the eastern part of Indonesia, they also still have accessibility issue, right? So when you are talking about, it's about transition out of fossil fuel generated power, but also when you are creating new or replacing the fossil fuel, you want to go to the clean energy, right? So that's and so how, but you need to do it at scale if you really want to have the decarbonization and the target of what was it, 2040 that Bambang mentioned to exit out of fossil fuel. You know, those are large investments. It's anything between 1 trillion just for the coal exit, 1 to 4 trillion for the renewable energy. These are just, very hard to estimate, but these are just some of the ballpark figures. So it's huge, large. So the big question is, how do we do it, right? How do we get there? Given you mentioned the war in Ukraine, everybody's trying to think through, how does this affect our climate agenda, our climate and development agenda? Is it going to put it on the back burner? Is it going to slow it down? And we hope not, but it is the reality that first, fiscal space is much more constrained. Second, we will see, we think in the short term, for advanced countries and for many other countries, a delay in the exit from the fossil fuel just because of the energy security issue. So now we have energy security in the mix, whereas the argument should be, and then you delay the transition to renewable energy. But when you have to do the catch up later, you have to do a greater acceleration of renewable energy transition. So that's kind of one of the tensions. So how do we continue to have the important narrative that if you want energy security as well as accessibility, affordability, and reliability, you can do it by diversification of all your energy sources, including renewable energy. So that's really where we came out in our most recent discussion when we reflected how do we see this war in Ukraine affecting our debate. Now, I can go into a bit more detail about what should be done and how, and then the financing part. How do you want to conduct the conversation? I was just trying to give you the broad picture to begin with, but we can go into, what were the three main recommendations that we came up with.
Thank you very much, Mary. I think this is very useful. But one thing that I would like to follow up, you mentioned about the energy transition, and I think this is very important because I do believe that if we are specifically talking about the emerging developing economies, I do believe that all of the developing economies are committed to reach about the net zero emission, but the question is always about the transition, the transitional risk, because this is not an easy thing. And if I borrow sort of like a term from Minister Sri Mulyani, she used the word the affordable transition. And I think this is very important because if the transaction cost is too expensive, then perhaps emerging developing economies, are reluctant to shift towards the green economy. And this year, Indonesia is host of the G20. Next year will be India, and then after that, Brazil. All of them come from the developing countries. So if we are talking about this energy transition and affordable transition, one of the biggest problem that we are facing now is also raising interest rate because the inflationary pressure. So it's not also easy for the emerging developing economies to, to borrow money or to mobilize fund from the market. Yeah. In the discussion at the World Bank, at the Multilateral Development Bank, if you can perhaps sort of like share with us maybe some possible source of financing that can help the emerging developing economies in transitioning towards the green economy. I think something that very important and also very useful. And there is a chicken and egg issues here, because I can imagine the donor country will say that show me the platform, but maybe many minister of finance from emerging developing economies will say that show me the money first. Yeah, it's sort of like chicken and egg. So if you can sort of like touch this issue.
Yeah. I think you put it well. The chicken and egg problem. Show me what you are going to do to where I can put my money, and then from the other side, okay, show me the money first, then I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I think you have to start with the fact that whether it's investors or even multilateral development banks, we want to know. When you're talking about where does the money go, you want to know that the money is going to be effectively used for the energy transition, say. So I think we need to spell out very well what we need to be on the same page. You call it a platform, but let's say we have to be on the same page of what we mean by just and affordable and energy transition, and I would put access in there as well, energy transition and access. So that's the conversation that we've been having with countries as well as in this high-level advisory group. And it turns out that it is chicken and egg, but there is a beginning to be a convergence about being on the same page. What is it that needs to be done kind of question in an energy transition. And we do start with the power sector, because the power sector is the key to then also lead to the energies, to the transportation sector, the industry sector, and so on. And if we focus on decarbonization of the power sector from coal or from fossil fuel, then a just energy transition comprises of accelerating the exit from the coal-based or fuel-based power plants, and in the case of Indonesia, it's mostly coal, and looking at it holistically, right, comprehensively. What does that mean? In many countries, it would mean you have to replace, at some point, you have to replace the power plant from coal to renewable energy. So there's an investment in renew. So there's a cost of exiting the coal, and then there's a cost or an investment need to invest in renewable energy. And then in the context of the high energy prices today and going forward, the issue of energy efficiency is very important. Actually, you can do a lot. Even it may take you. Say we are supposed to. I think 2046 was the endpoint of most of our coal-fired power plants. If you bring it to 2030 or even 2035, you're still talking about 5-10 years of using coal-fired power plants. You can still do a lot to introduce energy efficiency, CCS, coal, CO2, what is it called? CCS is carbon storage and sequestration of the CO2, the methane part of it. So there's a lot you can do in the existing power plants. And that involves technology and also cost. And the other part of it is you want reliable energy supply. So you need to invest in the grid, especially once you start having renewable energy come in. The intermittent supply needs to be making you invest in a modern grid, right? So that's another component of it. And then there's the just transition part of it, just and sustainable part of it, which is once you close down the coal-fired power plant, the coal mines, you got to clean up. And some of it can be repurposed, but there's a lot of environmental cleanup that needs to be done. That's a cost. And then all the workers and the regions that are affected once there's no more coal mine or no more coal-fired power plants. That's a comprehensive picture of what needs to be done, and how much of that does the country governments do in terms of the policy reforms, and therefore to be able to attract and come up with an estimate of the cost. I believe Indonesia estimated the cost at 300 billion. I remember Sri Mulyani sort of sending the bill to Mark Carney. Out of the 130 trillion, I only need, originally it was 270 billion, but now it's 300 billion. So where does this 300 billion go, right? To all the costs there. And how much of that will the government come up with? And how much of it will be the government reforms and regulatory changes, right? And that's kind of the big ask. So that was the first, actually, I'm already getting into the recommendations of the high-level advisory group. So government leadership to manage energy transition and create demand for investment is key, right? This is the chicken and egg. So you have to believe that there's the money out there, but the money needs to know where to go. And I think one of the important things that you and I have talked about over the years is that this doesn't cost. It doesn't relate to a budget cost necessarily. Maybe it does, but it is about the relative price of carbon, right? This is about the fuel and electricity subsidies, because the relative price of carbon is going to be part of that certainty of the investment environment to invest in renewable energy and to exit from fuel-based or fossil fuels. But we know this is politically difficult, politically sensitive, but I think that's one key component, getting the relative price of carbon right, which is partly the subsidies issue, the carbon taxes, carbon trading. I think that's part of the regulatory environment, and coming up with, we know this is the way to go, that you should let the prices reflect the carbon content, and you want to have it affordable, so you do want to have protection programs or targeted programs, either for the poor and vulnerable households or the small and medium-sized enterprises or whatever it is, but you got to do it targeted, right? So that's kind of one important signal, I would say, before you do all the other difficult reforms like renewable energy reform, utility reform, and so on. And then if I can just finish, at least for your question, I'm answering your question in a kind of a lengthy way. How about the money? Where does the money, how does the money come in? So from our perspective, we did a survey of investors, what do they see? And they see that there's a real and perceived risk in energy transition. And it is because of the policy and regulatory environment and the lack of legal certainty over a long period of time, right? Because this is long-term investment with high risk. So you need and that's where the homework for the government, and to have a long-term low carbon development strategy, and the energy transition over a long-term period with clear targets. Okay, we're going to get out of coal by this time. We're going to have electric vehicles by this time, just like Pak Bambang mentioned earlier. Very clear, but credible, right? Not just a number, a number in a pie in the sky. So how do you have the targets that is plan and target setting, strong regulatory policy frameworks to indicate the direction of the policy over a long term, and that's the sector risk that you want to reduce from an investor or even from a donor of concessionary funding perspective. And then there's the project risk. So there is a sector risk and a project risk. And the project risk relates a lot to, okay, who's the off-taker here? The off-taker is the utility company. Is that creditworthy? Is it going to be for sure be able to take it to be the off-taker? We do have problems with the take or pay contract. How do you actually deal with that kind of situation, and so on? So then you think about de-risking instruments, whether it's guarantees or even providing funding, and World Bank does provide funding, and all these. There's a lot of climate investment funds and so on to help create the projects, right? The bankable projects that you need to be in the pipeline, and come up with a platform of projects that are across the board. It can be the coal exit, so a robust pipeline that includes energy efficiency projects, renewable energy storage, coal power, retirement, grid, and so on. So this is the pipeline that will make you credible, and it will also help to cross-subsidize, if you like. There will some which renewable energy under the right policy environment can be profitable, and that is the most attractive for private investors. But they have to be clear about the off-taker, the pricing, and the certainty that that the coal would phase out, and they would be coming in large scale to supply the renewable energy. But even in that case, countries need help and capacity building to be able to design the bankable project. So that's where concessional funding can come in. And then you have the longer term kind of maybe project guarantee, first loss guarantees, and so on. There's a range of risk reduction instruments there. And the final thing I would say, I think you have a session on this, is let's not forget the role of domestic investors in this, right? And the role of investments that are coming in from the capital markets, from the banking system. So there's a whole discussion about greening the financial sector, and what does that mean in terms of the regulations that need to be there, and the disclosure requirements and so on, because the source of green financing will have to come not just from strategic investors that actually invest in these projects, but also the financing from the financial sector, including what we know as voluntary carbon credits.
Let me follow up on two things, Ibu Mari. I completely agree with you. The first question is, you mentioned about the importance of investment, both from the foreign investment and also domestic investment in related to the renewable energy. But this investment will require a good investment climate. Right? And talking about investment climate, this is a very classic problem in many developing economies, including Indonesia, for example. And so if we are looking about this possibility of the investment in renewable energy, perhaps this will take some time before we can expect that the investment will come to many developing economies due to a lot of problems related to less established institution, the regulatory framework, the capacity of the bureaucracy, etc. My first question is there any way that that we can sort of like have the shortcut in order to address this issue rather than wait for, I don't know, 10 years, 50 years before we can implement all these policy recommendation, because it will require a good institution? That's the first one. The second one, you mentioned about the political economy. Yeah, this is not an easy time. And unfortunately, like what we are seeing today in the case of Indonesia, at least statement in the newspaper, the Indonesian government decided not to adjust the gasoline price for this year. Yeah, and also the natural gas price. Again, because the food prices increase. So this is not easy. I like to what quote from Jean-Claude Juncker. He said that we all know what to do, we just don't know how to get reelected after we've done it. So this is really the issue. So if we look at the reality check, yeah, how feasible is it? The policy recommendation made by donor country, the multilateral agency, and also from the perspective of the investment, or is there any way that, looking from the time frame perspective, that could be done as a success story?
That's a really good question, but not an easy one to answer. I don't think there are any shortcuts or easy way to do this. But what I think we could do, as always, I think we are all students and practitioners of how to do reform. I think what I outlined earlier was kind of the big framework and what needs to be done. You're right that it's complex. But what is clear is that it is complex and it will take time. And actually, we also have done studies on how other countries have gone through this, mainly in Eastern Europe, because they had clear targets because of belonging to the European Union, right? So they had this clear timeline when to exit. But even in a country like Poland, it took like 10 years to get out of coal, and then with all the complications that I just described to you. So it does take time. So I think what we need to do is, as always, find the quick wins, or what do we do in the short term while continuing to focus on the long term? I think that's kind of the short answer. But what does that mean? What can we do in the short term? I think in the short term, getting relative price of carbon right, having a path. I mean, I think people don't expect a lot of, but that's what I heard. We don't expect, what's the price of carbon now? $2 or $6 is it in Indonesia? In Europe, it's like $90. We don't expect tomorrow Indonesia is going to go to $90, but as long as we see the signal that it's going in that direction, and you start building out the capability to have the measures and the standards and have the trading. And I think one big issue that I kept on hearing was that we need to be able to internationally trade these carbon credits. Otherwise, the price is not going to. There's not enough there will not be enough demand for it, even though if there's a supply. So I think that to me is done in the right way and in a kind of a progression. I mean, removing of the subsidies can be done progressively. Not, I think we don't talk about what we did in 2005, where we raised the price by 130% and then repurpose it. I think that's not the way to do it anymore in today's very complex, more complex political and high price situation. I think you have to do, I think, which is what the government is doing already. You slowly remove the subsidy on different types of fuel, right? But in a progressive way. But as long as that's seen, and even electricity, I think you can do a similar thing. I think that's, I'm just trying to think of other quick wins. I think what the government has also done very successfully is issue green bonds, right? Green bonds and green sukuk bonds, green bonds, sustainable bonds. And I sort of remember this conversation even 2 years ago. Sri Mulyani was complaining, look, we did the green bonds, but we didn't get any premium. But more recently, I heard her talk about the same thing and saying that we are now getting, I think it's 0.5, is it the premium or yeah. So it's happening. And that must be showing that, whether it's your green budgeting principles or some of the progress that you've made in your reforms are happening. So I think that those are some of the quick wins. While you do have to build up the institution, and we know this is something that is faced by Indonesia and many other developing countries. I think one of the big issue that we know, this is we have discussed this many times, is the role of the utility, right? How do you have a commitment anyway? We are not talking about privatization. We are talking about making it more efficient, making it function more like a corporation, etc., right? Corporatization, I think, is the word for it. I think what I'm trying to say is that signaling the direction is very important. We know it will take time. And the other one is the renewable energy. There is already a renewable energy pricing regulation that is supposed to be coming out soon, right? That will be, I think, another important signal, and making sure that the tender process, the procurement process for the renewable energy projects are going to be done in a very transparent and competitive way, because that's another signal, even though this will take time also. So I am not sure I've answered your question, but it would be good to discuss, what are some of the short-term things we can do. I know that one of the ideas is perhaps to pick a few of the coal plants that are already inefficient or already old, that you would be able to exit, that should be exited anyway, and show that you could actually, maybe that's where some of the concessional funding out there can come in to do that, or the government itself sharing the cost of that, to show that we are serious about reducing the coal plants, especially starting with the more inefficient one. But it can't just be about shutting down coal plants. It has to be part of that broader strategy and a clear plan, how you're going to do it over 10 years or over 20 years.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Mary. And I think one thing that's also very important is the narrative. Yeah, because actually we can try to find a sort of like a policy that co-benefits both vulnerable groups and also good for green, for example, because nowadays many developing economies are facing a problem of the food security problem. Yeah, increase of the food prices, for example, and then this will require a big chunk of the budget for the social protection, and this money can be stemmed from the reduction of the fuel subsidy, because a study done by World Bank and also IMF shows that it is the top 20 receive 6 times benefit more than the bottom 20 regarding the fuel subsidy, because they consume more. So this kind of narrative. So rather than saying that we reduce the fuel subsidy, but we redirect the subsidy for the targeted one. And of course, the issue of data is very important. So I think that the narrative is very important here. But I would like to ask you a question more on the financing issue. Pak Bambang mentioned about the limited capacity of the domestic financing, because a country like Indonesia or maybe some other developing economies, we don't have a very deep financial deepening. The financial market is relatively, it's not deep, it's relatively shallow. So one of the important issue is to look at about the possibility of the innovative financing, for example. I don't know whether this is social impact bond or blended financing or this kind of new innovative financing. But one of the biggest problem that faced by many developing economies, including countries like Africa, is the capacity building. Because if you want to design a project, for example, related that need sort of like financing, like blended finance, for example, this is not an easy thing, because somehow you need to estimate about the social benefit, in order to ensure what is the government contribution, the private sector contribution, etc. And then many developing countries are facing a problem of the limited capacity. Is there any sort of like a plan that World Bank or the multilateral institution is prepared to help on this particular issue, so developing countries or emerging market can have an access for this kind of innovative financing?
No, that actually gets back to your chicken and egg problem again, because I think innovative financing is about how do you use, there's the public component is comprising of government as well as multilateral development banks loans, which can be lower cost than commercial loans. And the way you would want to use this financing is to catalyze the large amount of private capital that you need for the scale of energy transition that we need, right? So it still comes back to creating the framework and the platform and pipeline of transformative, I'm not going to call them bankable, pipeline of transformative projects that different, so you have different funding needs, and then you want to mobilize and pool the financing to come together around this this platform or pipeline of projects, right? And that's what will bring the financing for investment to a emerging market. And that's where what we can do as development banks is to support the government in trying to design that kind of pipeline, because you can sort of think of it like this: there are projects in that platform of pipeline of projects. There are projects that would be attractive to the private sector. Let's take renewable energy investments. Assuming you have the right kind of regulatory environment on the procurement, on the pricing, but even in that situation, you would need to have support, and there's a bunch of financing. You can access this financing. There's climate finance, there's global infrastructure fund. These are funds that there's SMAP, which focuses on energy. Many of these are housed in the World Bank. They help the country to design the project and also help to develop. I know you have been very involved in this in the past. I don't know whether you're still in that infrastructure investment what was it? No longer there. But I remember you always say it's too. The standards are always too high. We can't meet it, right? So how do you help to create these projects? And then you have a projects like investing in storage or which have externalities, but no private investor is going to come in without a part of it being funded by concessional funding or by government, right? And then there's a part where it's just a cost, like exiting from coal or compensating the workers. That's just a cost, but you still need to fund it. But all this actually needs to come together. Investing in grid is another one that may or may not attract private sector. So you need to combine the concession funding with to catalyze the private funding. But underlying that is always also the policy issues on top of that. So I think the way to go is to try to design that, but given what we talked about earlier, this is complex, this is long-term. How do we find a platform of a pipeline that is workable and doable in the short run, right? But that it's clear, that it's part of a broader framework. And then that you will see that the concessional funding will come in, the philanthropies who will want to come in. That whole platform, it's about how do I reduce the cost and how do I reduce the risk? What are the instruments? What are the financing and policy instruments or even technology support that will bring down the cost and bring down the risk so that it can happen in a country? And the final thing I would say is that if you could actually demonstrate that, and this is actually the big discussion going on everywhere, can we actually demonstrate this? Everybody talks about this. Can we actually demonstrate this and implement this? And the other source of financing I forgot to mention is voluntary carbon markets, right? Can you actually calculate the exit of coal is translated into this much CO2 reduction, which is translated into this amount of carbon credit? Then the financial investors will want to come in and provide this funding through the voluntary carbon market. That's another source of funding, right? So that's trying to happen, but we don't have actually a concrete proof of concept yet. So this is what needs to happen. And once you have that, then maybe you can scale up, right? So that to me is the short-term and long-term debate that we just had just now.
Well, I'm sure we can continue our discussion, but our time is limited. But before we conclude our conversation, let me ask you my last question. This is rather sensitive. We read a statement come from Secretary Yellen, and she said that the Bretton Woods institution was not designed for the multifaceted crisis, including issue of the climate, the pandemic, etc. Then this will require a sort of like a reform in the Bretton Woods institution. You are sitting in the Bretton Woods institution. Is there any comment related to that?
Yes, this is obviously something we're discussing also. I'll just make two comments. First comment is that I think it's true that now we do need to reform in the way we identify what we do, right? It's always been about development, reducing poverty, and shared prosperity. But now the challenge is, and this is the challenge for the reform that she's talking about, how do we also deliver global public goods like climate, right? Or even like health, the pandemic, for instance, means that you do have to have pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response, which is a global public good. How do you, and that's where World Bank and many multilateral development banks, we work on country-based model. We work with the country, and that's how we actually introduce the global public goods element of it. So you develop, but you also want to make sure you do it in a sustainable way, et cetera, et cetera. But that's always been like country-based. Now you got to take it to another level and say, okay, it's country-based, but we can identify, countries by how much they actually can contribute to the global public good of climate. You can identify the countries which are the major coal emitters, for instance. You can identify the countries, say, on forestry and land use. So you can identify that they would contribute to the global public goods if we got the policies right and if we provided the funding. But the funding is not going to be, our funding is not going to be enough to deliver on the global public goods. But that's where the big question is. If you're going to be asked, okay, this is good for your country's development, but you're also contributing to global public goods, what's your incentive? And that's where that financing component we were talking about comes in. Okay, if we can actually show it that it's good, you're doing this for your own country's green climate and development, but you're also contributing to global public goods. You should be rewarded, or there should be an incentive for you and getting more financing. Okay. Then the second part of the answer is, where does this additional financing, needed financing, come from? We can do a lot to optimize our balance sheet, and we are doing that and finding ways to increase what we have. But there's only so much we can do. I mean, there was a lot of discussion about our AAA rating and whether you could accept a lower go AA, and then you'd have more to lend. But that I've just had a briefing from our financial part of the bank. They say you can do it, but it's going to cost you, and it will end up leading to lower amounts and higher costs. So it's not a workable solution. At the end of the day, it does have to come to that where there has to be more available, that is for the global public good, whether it's coming from increased capital to the multilateral development banks, or bilateral donors can come up with a pot of money and call it, this is for climate, this is dedicated funding for climate, and then come in that platform, you know. But the second part of it is that you do need more financing, the type of financing that will finance to catalyze the private sector, just the way we talked about just then.
Thank you very much, Ibu Mary. Thank you for your time and also sharing with us. Unfortunately, time is up and we have to end our conversation, but this is very useful to give a sort of like ground for the next session. I believe that all other speakers are ready for the next session. So once again, thank you very much, Mary Pangestu, Managing Director of the World Bank. Thank you. Thanks for joining us.
Bye.
Thank you, Pak Dede dan Bu Mari, for your very insightful session from the perspective of multilateral institution, developing countries. We'll proceed to the stage of the webinar, which is our first panel on the development aspect of climate transition toward net zero emission. This session will last around an hour, and I would like to invite Kevin Gallagher, T20 Task Force of International Finance and Economic Recovery Co-Chair, and the moderator of the session, to the stage. Kevin Gallagher is a professor of global development policy at Boston University's Carnegie School of Global Studies, where he directs the Global Development Policy Center. And his latest book is The Case for the New Bretton Woods. So I believe that the previous discussion laid a very solid foundation for our next talks on your session, Kevin. So Kevin, without further ado, over to you.
Thank you very much, and welcome to everyone today. My name is Kevin Gallagher. I'm one of the co-chairs of the International Finance track here at the T20, and we have an exciting panel here today. Earlier this year, the United Nations said it's now or never on climate change. That's an inconvenient truth at an inconvenient time, given the multiple crises that are facing the world economy right now. As our speakers this morning or today have already said over and over again, that part of the solution is a stepwise increase and mobilization of finance across the world to transform our economies to be low carbon and more socially inclusive, but also a fundamental transformation of the policy frameworks and incentives to be able to align the economy with these broader goals. And that is a significant challenge for emerging market and developing economies. Even before Putin's war in Ukraine, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund in January of this year were sounding the alarms that 60% of emerging market and developing countries were already in debt distress. They were having trouble spending, creating the fiscal space to attack the virus and try to recover. Countries like Nigeria, before the oil prices went up, were spending 90 cents of every tax dollar on servicing external debts. And so the particular challenge for emerging market and especially low-income countries and domestic resource mobilization is completely grave. The math just does not add up. Obviously, with the war, now we have massive spikes in food and fuel, and those high and rising interest rates in the north, which is causing exchange rate depreciation and capital flight from the south at exactly the same time when the UN is telling us it's now or never to mobilize incredible amounts of finance. Not only are they almost impossible to mobilize domestically, rather than flowing to developing countries, most of them are sucking out and going back to the safe havens of OECD and especially key currency countries. At the same time, the international system has been slow or almost absent to respond. The $100 billion, which is a politically determined number, obviously nowhere near the scale of all of the estimates that we've been hearing about all today. That has not been forthcoming. There has not been thus far any real movement on increasing the paid-in capital of the multilateral development banks, nor reforming some of the flawed governance components of them, nor increasing the lending headroom, which even while maintaining a AAA rating, they could collectively increase lending by about $1 trillion over in between now and in 2030. One bright spot in the system has been in April, the IMF approved something called the Resilience and Sustainability Trust, which the idea would be to help countries with the macro critical impacts of climate transitions. Unfortunately, most developing countries have said that they would be very reluctant to go to that instrument because you have to have an SBA or a UCT IMF agreement in place in order to access this long-term climate change money. So a country like Indonesia would have to be in a major recession and balance of payments crisis in order to access money for climate transitions. And so there's a lot of work to be done on that instrument to improve it. There's also major coordination issues that need to be addressed, which are at the heart of the G20, obviously, as a major global coordinating body. A number of studies have showed that a particular issue that we need to pay attention for from a development perspective are what are called transition spillover risks. At the NGFS, when you're looking at just national economies, we focus a lot on physical risks. What is the impact of a hurricane on the macro critical aspects of, say, Barbados? Or what is the transition risk? What would happen if South Africa or Indonesia wound out of coal and moved into renewables? Obviously, that would have lots of balance of payments, fiscal impacts, and employment impacts during such a transition. One that's getting increasing attention, which in our space here at the G20 and in a global governance perspective, are transition spillover risks. Many studies have shown that the Europeans, who should be applauded for moving forward and moving first on carbon pricing, they'll also be matching that carbon pricing with a carbon border adjustment mechanism. But a number of studies have showed that those kinds of mechanisms have transition spillovers on developing countries, which would have severe economic impacts on countries like Mozambique, Ukraine, Bolivia, and many other countries in terms of their balance of payments and other macro critical aspects. Recent study with respect to Indonesia, since we're in Indonesia today, has shown that as China moves to its 2060 commitments, obviously that would have a big impact on Indonesian exports of coal to China, which could cause severe balance of payments consequences. So here we have a very distinguished panel of three very interesting individuals who will engage in this conversation on what are the development dimensions of these climate transitions that we need to manage. The panelists have been asked a number of questions: how to bridge the climate action financing gap between developed and developing countries, how to minimize the financial instability, some of the things that I was just referencing to about that transition. Obviously, structural transformation from one form of an economy to another causes a lot of adjustment, and there are adjustment costs in the real and the financial economy. And importantly for this world here that we're in, this global governance space, are what role should be served by international financial institutions to support this transition? What kind of coordination is needed within and across countries? And how do you minimize the socioeconomic risks of these really profound transformations? So we have three incredible speakers today, and they'll speak in the following order. I'll give short bios of each of them. More extensive ones are on their web pages. These are some of the leading thinkers and doers on these issues in the world economy. We'll start with Jeffrey Frankel. He's currently the Harpel Professor of Capital Formation and Growth at Harvard's Kennedy School. He's also a research associate at the National Bureau of Research. He's also been a policymaker at the President's Council of Economic Advisors in the United States, and is a world-renowned international economist on all things about the global economy, but has a long history of working on the environment and climate change. We'll also have Montek Ahluwalia. He's an economist, well-known and civil servant and former deputy chairman of the Planning Commission of the Government India. He's now a distinguished fellow at the Center for Economic and Social Policy in India, formerly Brookings, India. Looking forward to hearing from him as well. And finally, our third speaker will be Iwon Aziz. He's a professor of emerging markets with the Dyson School of Applied Economics and Management at Cornell University, where he was the director of graduate studies there. Each one of these speakers have been asked to speak for around 7 minutes. I'll try to keep a tight rein on that. And then we'll ask all of you in the audience. This will be a chance for you to engage with these three folks and on these issues. Because we have so many people, we're not going to be able to sort of beam you in to ask our speakers questions. If you look at the bottom right-hand corner of your Zoom screen, you'll see a Q&A button. So please do two things. One, tell us your name and affiliation so we can get to know each other and try to make this more human. And two, ask a very short question. And I'll do my best to field a handful of them and do a few rounds with the speakers, depending upon how much time we have in this tight hour. So without further ado, please let me start with Professor Jeffrey Frankel from Harvard University.
Well, thank you, Kevin. Thank you for moderating. I'd like to thank Day for inviting me. It's a privilege to be leading off this distinguished panel. I've got a slide presentation. To be honest, prepared too many slides. There we go. I hope everyone can see it now. My presentation addresses a very specific question. How do we evaluate which countries do their fair share in pledged carbon emission reductions? And there is a connection to climate finance, which I will mention, but some of that will be left for Q&A. So I'm focusing on the targets that are set. The Paris Agreement, of course, set nationally defined contributions where each country volunteered what it thought it could do. Often implicit in that or explicit were specific targets for emissions of greenhouse gases. And in the Glasgow Climate Pact in November, the communique said all countries should strengthen the targets in their NDCs relative to Paris. President Biden in 2021 announced a US target, which is slightly more ambitious than the one in Paris, 50% below 2005 levels. And so did Canada and Japan and some other countries. Those sound like pretty big numbers, but that's relative to a baseline, which is starting from very high level of emissions. So how do we evaluate whether US, Canada, developing countries are doing their fair share of reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, which I think is really a key critical question to making the whole system work. Having this kind of, you can't hold countries accountable to emissions targets if you don't have agreement on what are the relevant criterion for what's a fair share. And it has to be different depending on the individual country's circumstances. There are other attempts to do this. Climate Action Tracker collects various attempts at scorecards. It just ends up rating most countries as insufficient or highly insufficient in their commitments, which no doubt is true, but doesn't help really with the relative burden sharing. And the problem is that perceptions of fairness, what is fair, vary wildly. I mean, just very orders of magnitude. So just to illustrate, here are CO2 emissions per capita across some countries, some of the G20 countries. And in 2020, the average citizen of the United States emitted 8 times more greenhouse gases than the average citizen of India. That's a slight update from the chart, but the pattern of 8 to 1 is still holds. And similar disparities. The average Saudi emitted 8 times as much as an average Indonesian. So that's per capita. So obviously there's something unfair about that. What is fair is different depending on different vantage points. From the vantage of India or Indonesia, a fair allocation might be equal emissions per capita all around. Americans, for their part, think it would be unfair to make the US businesses pay a very high economic cost to reduce emissions, especially if energy-intensive industry simply relocated to other countries that had not constrained their own emissions. These two concepts of fairness are just light years apart, and they give very different answers as to what's reasonable. Each side has a point. It's unreasonable to ask poor countries to cut the same percentage as rich countries, which would deny them the opportunity for economic growth that the rich countries have already enjoyed. On the other hand, it's unrealistic, I don't say unfair, but unrealistic to expect rich countries to agree to equal emissions per capita. That would be, that's, as I say, light years away from what countries are actually prepared to do. It would be equivalent to transferring truly massive slices of GDP, which might be fair, talk about reparations or whatever, but it's just not remotely going to happen. I believe that one can quantify what are fair and reasonable targets for each country in a way that you could have some consensus on. 3 principles. Cost. It is not realistic to expect any one country to agree to cuts that result in disproportionately large economic costs for it. They're just not going to do it. And I mean cuts relative to what emissions would otherwise have been, the so-called business as usual path. Second principle, progressivity. Rich countries should accept bigger cuts than poor countries. And what I have in mind is, at least for the early budget periods, targets for poor countries that are generous enough and close enough to their business as usual path that they would actually come out financially ahead. They could sell emission permits to high income countries. And this is, just from my perspective, the right way to think of climate finance if you really wanted to achieve actual reductions in realized in greenhouse gas emissions. The third factor is a latecomer catch-up factor. It's fair to expect countries that have increased their emissions, like the US, to bring them back down toward past levels, but it's unrealistic to expect them to do it extremely rapidly, too costly. It's not practical for them to reverse fully and instantaneously in the first budget period, but as time goes by, they should get less and less weight on their current emissions. So to bolster this framework, I have looked at what were agreed in past COPs, what was agreed at Kyoto, and what was agreed at Paris. And there is progressivity in those numbers. Richer countries agreed to steeper cuts than others relative to BAU. In Kyoto, the agreement, every 10% rise in income per capita corresponded to an agreed reduction of emissions of another 1.4% relative to BAU. And in Lima, which is what was feeding into Paris, every 10% rise in income corresponded to another greenhouse gas cut of 1.7% relative to BAU, which is interestingly similar to what was agreed in Kyoto. Not actually done, but agreed. The COP targets also show this latecomer catch-up factor, pulling each country's back towards what its emissions were in 2005. And I would propose to extend the formula through the remainder of the century with gradually decreasing weight on the level of emissions that you're coming from, and gradually increasing weight on equal per capita emissions. So in the long run, by the end of the century, we would be at equal emissions per capita, which is certainly fair, a notion of fairness, and one that's more practical. And estimates using models show that country losses could be capped below 1% of GDP in present discounted value using these formulas, which is not the case for most other proposals for what would be fair. Here's just some of the four of the references that I'm basing these numbers on. Here's for people interested in econometrics. Here is the statistical evidence that the emissions agreed to in 2014 to take effect in 2020 do react statistically, do show statistical significance for progressivity. There's a minus 0.14. And then this latecomer catch-up factor that you go halfway back to what your emissions level was in 2005. Probably a chart would be more enlightening. The horizontal axis is income per capita of the country. The vertical axis is what they pledged in, it's 7 years ago, to hit emission reductions by 2020. Also, there are targets for the more distant future, of course, up to 2050 and beyond, but I sort of have a little less faith in those as being meaningful, since it's easy to promise what your country will do after you, the leader, are dead. There's the pattern. So the good news is that it is, I believe, possible to agree on what constitutes fairness in a way that is economically efficient and achieves the desired goals. The bad news is that most countries have failed by 2020 to achieve the reductions that they promised, that they targeted. So my conclusion is that stronger country commitments to specific numerical targets are needed. A good place to start would be to report publicly which countries have met the emission targets that they set for 2020 and which have not. That's kind of just the bare minimum starting point for accountability. Also, a good place to start would be to evaluate whether the current pledges for 2030 and 2050 and beyond, but more concretely 2030, evaluate whether they show individual countries doing their fair share of the global burden when judged by criteria of the sort that I have proposed. Also needed to, I think, make it work is an international agreement that allows countries that have made and are abiding by commitments for reductions to impose a carbon border adjustment tax. Kevin mentioned this, that's relevant to the carbon intensive imports from those countries that have not adopted targets or are not abiding by them. Okay, I hope I didn't go over my 7 minutes too much.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Frankel. A little bit, but that's okay. Looking forward to hear now from Montek Aluwalia. Good to see you again. Dr. Aluwalia, you're on mute. Can you undo your mute? Thank you.
Okay, sorry, Kevin. First of all, thank you for having me on the panel. And hi, Jeff, good to catch up with you after so many years. I've been listening to some of the earlier panelists. It's a very rich discussion. So I'm really going to try and highlight a few things, but maybe in a somewhat disconnected way. Let me make some points, which I think are important. First, I think the outcome of COP26 was very important in one important respect, and that is it was the first time that all developing countries actually agreed voluntarily to reduce their carbon emissions to net zero by sometime in the mid-century. Different dates, but pretty much in the mid-century. In the past, they'd only been willing to agree to reduce the emissions intensity of GDP. That, of course, doesn't mean a reduction in emissions, because if GDP is rising, and we all hope we're working to make GDP rise, you can have a reduction in emissions intensity with emissions actually going up. And right up to Paris, that was the position. What COP26 did was for the first time to get a voluntary declaration by all developing countries that they intend to go to net zero. And I completely agree with what Jeff said, that we ought to be monitoring progress made by countries against their own self-declared targets. So now there are two problems that come up, which I think, I'm taking the T20 as not a shadow COP, in the sense that I assume the individual research institutions are not just going to repeat what their governmental positions are, but to bring some kind of think tank capacity to bear on the difficult issues. So from that point of view, I would say we need to recognize two problems. One, is what has been promised enough? And it's very clear that it's not. I mean, very roughly, we've done some work on this, and my impression is that after Paris, if you thought everybody was going to meet their commitments, we seem to be set on a 2.8 degrees centigrade increase in temperature above pre-industrial levels. The target set in Glasgow, quite rightly, was less than 1.5 degrees, because anything above that really does involve huge costs, not only for developing countries, but also developed countries, but certainly for developing countries, pretty disastrous. So the real question is, what have the COP26 targets, if achieved, assured us? And I gather that probably they assure us something of the order of a 2.4 degrees centigrade increase. We're nowhere near 1.5. So the good news is that COP26 is a lot better than Paris, but COP26 is not enough. And this is acknowledged in the Glasgow Pact, because the Glasgow Pact says that all countries should redefine their targets so that they can actually make them more reasonable. And this is where Jeff's suggestion of how to find fair ways of doing it deserves some consideration by think tanks. I mean, ideally, he posed the two extremes. The Indians and the Indonesians would obviously want per capita. The others would say no. So the question is, can we have something reasonable in between? We've done some examination of what the COP26 targets would do, and it's quite interesting. I mean, if every country which made a commitment met its commitments, and you look at what the IPCC says is the remaining carbon budget, which is what needs to be, so to speak, allocated across countries, then China, with 18.5% of the world's population, would be claiming 50.4% of the remaining budget. The US, with 4.2% of the world's population, would be claiming 13.2% of the remaining budget. I'm not talking here about equalizing per capita. We're just talking about how much of a share of the remaining budget our country is going to get. Europe, with 6.8% of the population, would be claiming 9.1% of the budget. India, with 17.7%, would be claiming 20.9%, a little bit higher than its share, but clearly much closer. Indonesia, with 3.5%, would be claiming 6.2%. One can do this for all the other countries. The critical point is, all countries, including developing countries, if you had some notion that a fair share of the remaining budget would be something close to per capita population, then the developed countries, China, and the larger developing countries, Indonesia, India, will all have to tighten their own targets more than what they are there. So I think, frankly, it would be very useful if the T20 think tanks would kind of give a sense of how do they think about this, because that needs to be fed back into the governments. The critical point here, which actually builds on what Jeff said, that, the principal responsibility for doing more than promise would lie with the developed countries. I mean, Germany has already said that they will go to net zero by 2045. So the question is, could we get both Europe and Germany to go, and Europe and the US and the UK to go to net zero by, say, 2040? If they were to do that, two things would happen. One is they would put a lot of legitimate political pressure on the developing countries to do their bit. But more importantly, if they took on that task, they would be triggering a lot of technological change, which would make it easier for developing countries to actually do what is needed. I mean, I have in mind, for example, progress in technology on green energy, progress in carbon capture and storage, which is actually quite critical. Because if you assume that carbon capture and storage will not be commercially viable, then we have to pretty much get rid of all fossil fuels. But if you find that carbon capture and storage can be made to work, and that does depend on technical change, then residual use of fossil fuel offset by CCS efforts becomes feasible. And that helps a lot in managing the grid with a lot of renewable energy, which is actually intermittent. I mean, the only way of balancing intermittent supplies is either batteries, which are very expensive, or a little bit of pairing with things like gas turbines, etc., which do emit some CO2. But, you know, that CO2 could be offset if carbon capture and storage actually becomes feasible. So I won't go on in this direction, but this is an issue that we need to consider. Now, the second question, one question is, can the developing countries even do what they've promised? Now, I'm not going to expand on this, but I've looked at what it means for India. And the short answer is, you know, we can go a long way. But the thing is that doing it requires taking a lot of difficult decisions. It's very easy for us to announce targets, but the difficult decisions are the ones which people hold back on. I think Marie mentioned, for example, carbon pricing. You know, it seems to me a no-brainer that if you're going to bring about such a massive transition, then we have to be willing to accept that there will be some carbon pricing, some elimination of fuel subsidies, things which at the moment any politician would find very difficult to do. But we need to build up an appreciation that without it, you're not going to get the end result you want. And by the way, this is another case where the developed countries can take the lead. If the developed countries were to introduce carbon pricing themselves and then insist on developing countries doing something similar, perhaps along the lines that the IMF has suggested, which is kind of progressive, higher tax, higher price in developed countries, lower price in developing countries, at least you've got a discussion going. Now, putting that aside, let me just come to the last bit. I have very limited time, I know. And that is the question of financing. Now, Marie has said everything that needs to be said, and a lot of these things are being discussed in the high-level action group, which she chairs. You know, I just want to put out for the T20 think tank audience the scale of the problem. You know, in 2000, we currently have a number, which is a sort of an agreed financial assistance combination of private and public, of about $100 billion, which was meant to be reached by 2020. We are nowhere near there, and the Glasgow Pact recognized that, and it said, well, hopefully we'll get there at 2024. Fair enough. But you know, what is needed is orders of magnitude different to achieve the kind of objectives we're talking about. And one indicator of order of magnitude difference is the work done by Nick Stern and his colleagues, Amar Bhattacharya and others. And they say that the additional investment, there can be an argument about what's really additional, but let's assume that they got it roughly right. The additional investment by 2025 would be approximately $1.3 billion. And this is what Janet Yellen meant when she said, they're talking about billions when we need trillions. Now, what I think Nick and company are suggesting, and this is again something that the T20 think tank should think about. First, that there's no chance of 1.3 trillion coming from developed countries in total. So one departure from the earlier expectation is that if that's what is needed, maybe half of that will have to be mobilized domestically. This is the first point on which you could take a rigid line that the UNFCCC said all the additional financing will come from outside. Frankly, there's not a chance of that. So are we willing to say, okay, we should do 50%? But if you do 50%, then what you're saying is that by 2025, the rest of the world should somehow be providing, through a combination of private and public, something of the order of $650 billion. Now that, according to Nick and company, is possible if bilateral aid is doubled, if multilateral lending is tripled, and if the private finance which is probably at the moment not very much more than 20, 30, 40 billion or so, goes up to 400 billion. These are huge increases, and it's very easy to say, A, it won't happen. B, one could say that, look, it takes a long time to absorb the scale of change needed, so let's just do the best we can. And I mean, particularly since this is a very difficult time to get international agreement on anything, we should count as a success any endorsement of broad ideas with some concrete movement forward, which is actually exactly what's going to happen in the developing countries, because nobody is laying out exactly what's needed to get to net zero, but everybody is doing something. And the question, therefore, is, are we doing enough? Let me just conclude on that note. I think there's a real danger. There's not a danger, there's a choice. One can look at what's going on and identify whether something good is happening, and you can be 100% sure that you will find there's lots of good things that are happening. The other approach is what is happening enough? And you can be 100% sure that it's not. So the question is, how do we move from here to there? That's really what we need to think about. And I hope that the T20 think tanks will put this in the context that this is a long-term game. We're not trying to achieve something within 1 year or within 2 years, but we've got to start the beginning of consensus building, and it takes a long time to get all of this done. But with political will, it can be done. The problem at the moment is that the politics is playing completely in the opposite direction. And frankly, it's not a secret, but the political willingness to support an expansion of multilateral development banks among the advanced countries is very low. The most there is a feeling that, look, if these are good projects, the private sector will do it. Certainly, there's a lot of money in the private sector. But to make these projects viable requires not just project identification, it requires policy change. And that policy change, in my view, is better mediated if the MDBs play an important role in it and get the governments agreeing to making the policy changes needed, etc., etc., etc. Well, thank you very much for allowing me to overstep my time limit.
Well, the one thing about Zoom is you can't take your ruler and wrap your fellow panelists' knuckles. But thank you for those incredible insights. And our last speaker before we have a global conversation about this will be Iwon Aziz. Iwon, please take it away.
Thank you, Kevin. I'm hearing a question of fairness that Jeff raised, and just now we heard from Montek about the sort of the long-term game. So what we are all talking here is a long-term game. The question is, what do we do? Should we do it now, or should we wait until everybody agree? So that's what so far I'm hearing. What I'm going to spend the next 7 minutes is really trying to answer the questions that the organizer asked. And if I may share, there are 3 questions that the organizer asked, and let me put up on the screen the question that has been raised, and I try to answer at least some of them. Let's see. I hope everyone can see this now.
Almost there, not yet.
Is it there now?
Yes, it is.
Okay, all right. So 3 questions. One is really the questions about what are the barriers to reach the net zero emission? The second question is really what kind of coordination is required? And since we are sort of in the T20, I presume that the question is referring to what can the G20 do here? And the last question, which I personally think is very, very important, especially from the developing countries' perspective, is really the questions about the socioeconomic impact of the energy transition. So I'm not going to spend too much time on some of the issue because, you know, the first few speakers already discussed about it. So for the interest of the audience, I think I'll try to pick up things that have not been discussed. Okay. First of all, when we're talking about the most significant barriers, I would say at least we can identify 4 factors. Number 1 is finance, and that has been discussed quite extensively. That finance constraint, the credit constraint, for example, is really, you know, a serious constraint for many developing countries in terms of green financing. The only things that I can add is that what type of financial structure that will affect the possibility of green financing. And recent ECB study shows that equity financing has the more prospect because equity financing investors are usually more willing to invest on green technology, and they're also more sensitive to the litigation costs, which may be caused by the environmental damage. But another important thing about financing is really what is the source of the financing? Now, in some developing countries, and I may use the example in Indonesia, some local governments are willing and able to raise funds from the so-called endowment fund. So some regions which are rich of the natural resources, but fossil fuel resources, they were able to allocate a lot of fund from the previous revenues to generate some sort of activities. Now, the question here, of course, whether the activities are really green activities. And that brings me to the questions of the certification. To what extent developing countries are able to convince the future investors, both domestic as well as foreign, about the greenness of the activities. And that is a big lack in many developing countries. No foreign investors are willing to go to invest in the so-called green investment when there was no certifications to what extent that green. And in fact, the issue of the green bond has been also discussed, to what extent the funding is really used for the green activities. So I will not spend more time than that because we have been discussing about this financing. So let me go to the second question asked by the organizer. What kind of coordination needed between developed and developing countries? I think Mary has sort of laid out the idea about what the World Bank and other international organizations can do to help the developing countries in terms of collecting all the funds that will be used for the green financing. Okay. Now, the only things that I would like to stress there or to add to understand is some examples that has been done before, similar to what Mary mentioned. One is the example of the Green Alliance. That has been discussed. In fact, some countries, including Japan, has strongly supported the idea of this Green Alliance, which is essentially the coordination in the international energy organization. The second example is in Europe, the European Union Initiative, which is the GCCA, Global Climate Change Alliance. Now, these are examples that has been done in the past. The question now is for the expert in the T20 is to evaluate and study to what extent those examples, and I'm only quoting 2, I'm sure there are many others, to what extent those examples of coordination has been giving the results? And if they didn't give the expected result, what are the reasons? So I think that is the way to go if the T20 teams is really trying to identify issues that stumble the effectiveness of the coordination, global coordination here. So I think that is the only thing that I can add on the global coordination. So let me spend more time on the last question, which is on the socioeconomic impact of the green transition in developing countries. Energy transitions, like any transitions, will always carry risk. Now, of course, we know the immediate risk in mind is really financial risk. If we take, for example, the case of bank, I mean, banks are less willing to lend money for activities that are green because of the risk. They fear of the currency mismatch. They fear of the maturity mismatch. So all kinds of these mismatches that haunt them will prevent them from being the major contributors to the financing of the green activities. So from that standpoint, we know that the risk of the economic risk of the green transitions is quite real here. And that's why I mentioned earlier, some of the analysis indicate that the future of the green financing is not really from the banking sector, but from the equity market. But the social impact of the green transition, of the energy transition, is quite serious in many developing countries, because when you are trying to move from one source of the energy, fossil fuel energy, in the regions that has been relying for decades on that energy, then there is a risk that the people who has been involved both directly and indirectly on activities related to those activities will be left out. So the question here is that whatever policies and ideas that is going to be proposed to proceed with the green transition, with the energy transition, must take into account what happened with those people in the areas, in the localities that are affected by that. So that is one issue that has to be sort of included in any policy initiative for the green transition. Now, in any transition, there's always involving people. In fact, people is the key part of all this. They are both the decision-making of the transition, and they decide not only whether or not to do the transition or not, but also what is the speed of the transition. But at the same time, they are also affected by the transitions here. So in other words, the policies that will be proposed hopefully is not just focusing on to what extent the transition is going to be successful, but also what are the repercussions on the people who are affected by the process of the transition. And I cannot think of a better way to sort of implement whatever policies by making it compatible with the prevailing social capital that is in that region, in the area that is affected by the green transition. Now, as I indicated earlier, the local government can raise revenue to finance the green transition, at least from two sources. One is taxing the dirty energy activities and subsidizing the clean energy activities. That's one way to do it. The second is for those regions that has been rich, that has been collecting revenues in the past from the dirty or fossil fuel energy sources. And I know I can think of one region in Indonesia, and that is Bojonegoro. And in Bojonegoro, the local government has been collecting revenues from oil because they are rich of oil, and they use some of the oil to finance some activities that is considered green. Now, there is always questions that I indicated earlier. How do you certify that those activities are green? So some of those activities can be sort of monitored not only being certified whether it's green or not, but monitored from time to time, because challenges are coming and we are entering an unknown areas here. To what extent the transition itself is already unknown, but to what extent the impact on the people affected by the transition is also unknown. So those are issues that I think has to be included in any discussions about policies that leads to the energy transition. So let me close by raising at least 3 prognoses that I can think of, and then I end up with the questions here. The first is that future trend of trade will definitely less on manufacture and more on the services. So the future trade will be heavy on the cross-border online trading activities. The second is that Asia, especially East, Southeast, and South Asia, will still be the dominant player in the world economy, and that constitutes about half of the world population already. And the third is, and this is a bit sort of pessimistic view, is that the chances that humanity will prevent damaging climate change, to me, it's rather slim, given all these discussions about what needs to be done, what has been done, but then there is no actual results. And that leads me to the early discussions about the COP26 and also the IPCC target. I was wondering, COP26 make a target that by 2030, which is 8 years from now, the CO2 emission has to fall by 45%. To what extent we can think of the achievability of that target, given the fact that currently the amount of emission is still continue to rise, and 2030 is only 8 years from now. So that is one. IPCC make a target of 2050. There will be net zero. And the way they propose is by introducing what Montek mentioned earlier, and that is, among other things, is CO2 sequestration. My question is that given tens of billion tons of the remaining CO2, how fast and how dramatic is the sequestration has to be done? So all in all, given those targets, it's hard for me to be optimistic that any of those targets can be achieved. And that is the reasons why I raised the third point. Now, given those 3 prognoses, my question is that since we are now in T20 and then we are discussing about the Asia, to what extent Asia will cope with these challenges given the, to some extent, unrealistic targets? So let me stop there.
Thank you very much, Dr. Aziz, and all of our panelists. If you could take down your PowerPoint presentation so we can, so the audience can see all of us. We have just about 10 minutes. I fielded some questions, and I think I'll throw them all out there, and then we can go in the order that we came and just give a 2-minute response, and also with any closing remarks that you might have. And so one of the things that came up in all of your presentations is the lack of political will to use the fiscal avenue to generate financing, especially in the North, to transfer significant amounts to the South that hasn't been forthcoming during promises during a more political, where there was more political will, and we shouldn't probably see much of that moving forward. Similarly with carbon taxes, a study just came out last week. They've been pretty good at raising money, maybe $84 billion, but not in changing behavior in the political will to raise fossil fuel energy taxes. I think we have a little stress test of what that looks right now. So that's sort of the conundrum that we're dealing with, that some of you looked at. And you also said there's not really a huge appetite for really increasing the capital base of the MDBs. So here's some things that have come up in one or two of mine, and some questions from the audience. So I think it was Dr. Ahluwalia who said, the money is there, but the political will and the incentives are not there. What about regulating the financial sector? We know that there are these voluntary ESG and some movement towards a taxonomy in Europe, but We also know that the sector is awash in greenwashing, with some CEOs actually going to jail last week in Germany on that. So what would you say about to what extent is there the political will or possibility to regulate finance so that it goes into productive green structural transformation and less so into carry trades and speculation and things of that nature? Number one. Number two, the Prime Minister of Barbados gave a striking speech at Glasgow, which said that if there isn't the political will and people aren't going to use their fiscal budgets, why not issue $500 billion worth of SDRs every year for the next decade and channel that into MDBs? The French Treasury is somewhat endorsing of something like that. I'd love to hear what folks have to say. And then second, actually the third one is there's less will to capitalize the MDBs, but the Finance and Comment Summit did a study that showed that there's about $14 trillion worth of development finance institutions in the world, and only 3.6 trillion of it are the MDBs. So if the MDBs can't lead, to what extent can the New Development Bank, the China Development Bank, the Islamic Development Bank, some of the ones that aren't led by Western shareholders with tight budgets and that are governed by some of this geopolitical tensions, to what extent can those efforts be bolstered? Definitely, there's lots of reserves and lots of capital in the South. Should they be put in non-Western led institutions? And the last comment and question is that adjustment in the case of adjustment costs, that's where the public returns far outweigh the private returns. And so how are we going to pay for that? Right? There's all this conversation about blending and getting and de-risking for the private sector. That might allow you to build a solar plants and wind power plants. But what about the entrepreneurs, the contracts, the communities, and the workers in the incumbent sectors in the Indonesias, the Indias, the Chinas, the South Africas, where such a transition would go? Is there a role for development finance? Can you get a loan for that? Or is that going to have to be grant funding? And where might that come from? Those are big questions of the day. That's what we heard in the chat. Very quickly, we only have 7 minutes now. So maybe just each of you pick one of those and make a final remark. I know we have a hard stop at 1:15 for our next panel. Start with you, Professor Frankel, if you could each go in the order that we.
Well, we have a plethora of good questions on the table. The big question on global climate finance is the complete mismatch between the amount of resources that are needed and what has been offered and what will be delivered, let alone what is prepared, what rich countries are prepared to deliver. My view, as I said, is that the right place for climate finance is for rich countries to pay developing countries for reductions in emissions below business as usual paths. Kevin, I believe in regulation of financial markets and banks. I don't think that is where the key is a key part of the solution. That's my view of the solution to climate change. I believe in increasing the capital of the multilateral development banks, and that is relevant to financing climate change, but it's only a small part of the total. I think you need to not just encourage corporations to transfer or to make green policies, because greenwashing, I think, is just absolutely inevitable. But I think if you use price mechanisms, we've heard about reducing subsidies. Montek mentioned that, subsidies to consumption of fossil fuels or production of fossil fuels. That's absolutely the essential part of it. And going beyond that to a tax on carbon or equivalently auctioning off tradable permits. Those are ways to generate a lot of finance, a lot of revenue, and automatically sends the incentives to the private sector to accomplish what you want. And of course, it's politically difficult, but everything here is politically difficult. And in this, at least, it's more feasible if it doesn't if it's an efficient way of addressing the question, which it is. And we thought, I mean, 20 years ago, it seemed like Europe would be much less likely than the US to adopt a price mechanism for carbon. And yet here we are with the emissions trading system. So that's where I'd look.
Thanks so much. Montek Aluwalia.
Hello. Thanks, Kevin. Well, some very quick comments. One, we should always remember that we are in a 30 to 40 year game, and it just happens that the next 2 years are not likely to see too much progress. But I don't think we should get discouraged by that. We should do as much hard work as possible to identify possible winners during those 2 years. And I think the T20 groups, by creating a consensual view across the different participants in the global economy, can make a major contribution. I certainly think that I agree with what Jeff said, that I think when people look reasonably at it, just as the multilateral development banks played a major role in pushing the development agenda earlier, you've now got a development agenda that is one way or the other going to be dominated by climate change. So we ought to do whatever is possible, even short of massive increases in capital, certainly things like gearing ratio changes and so on, so that for the next 2 or maybe even 3 years, we can see a big increase in lending from the development banks. And I mean all development banks, not necessarily the ones that are dominated by the industrialized countries. So everyone's welcome to pitch in. I think in this whole process of trying to mobilize funding, one of the issues, which is again controversial, and would be worth the T20 thinking about it, if you want to develop a momentum within the development banks, showing how successful they can be in climate change, if nothing else as an investment in credibility for future support, maybe you can argue that all new lending or most of new lending by these institutions should be directed to climate finance and climate finance related matters. Now, this is a controversial issue because all those who've been working in other sectors will say, oh, that's not really fair. But if you have a constraint on resources, if you think the multilateral development banks could bring a lot of credibility to an effort to underpin climate financing, which is also new, which needs developing country governments to get into it in a big way, that's something you might want to consider, maybe for the next 2 or 3 years. And as it turns out that people will resent the fact that they're not doing traditional lending, that can be a reason for arguing for a capital increase, supported by those who feel those lending activities should also continue. And I think finally, the carbon tax, although it was mentioned that there are some reports that they raise a lot of revenue but don't change behavior. I mean, the truth is revenue is going to be very scarce. So even if they do that, it's worth having a carbon tax because it's the best way of raising revenue from the point of view of funding all the things you need to do. And developing countries will need a lot of revenue in the years ahead. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And last word by Dr. Aziz. Excuse me, I'm sorry, you're on mute.
Sorry. Well, finance is important, and as I indicated earlier in my presentation, a lot has been discussed about finance, and the organizer thinks that this session should also discuss about development issue. I would like to sort of represent the conditions that are faced by many developing countries. It's not really just about the money. When we are talking about the development impact of any project, any ideas, including energy transitions, we need to really look at what are the impacts of the local communities that is affected by that. And to repeat what I said earlier, so while funding is very important, especially at the early stages, and I appreciate what has been discussed about all kinds of initiative or financings, but non-financial issues will be dominant in many developing countries in terms of public support. What's the point of having wonderful ideas and enough funding, but did not receive public support? So when in the spirit of getting the public support, I think matching all the policies, making it compatible with the prevailing social capital will be the way to go. So again, once and I heard earlier that Montek mentioned there will be a lot of funding coming from the IFI. Remember, we have the lesson in the past. What's the sort of undesirable impact of the foreign money, international organization funding and so forth. So let's not repeat that. And that's why, since we are now at the early stage of this green financing and so forth, I'm only appealing that we should also look at the development impact. What are the repercussions on the real people, on the localities in which the transition is going to take place? Thank you.
Thank you, Jeffrey Frankel, Montek Ahluwalia, and Iwon Aziz. Thanks for this great conversation. Thank you in the audience, and thank you especially Mr. Ahluwalia for telling the think tank and research community what you need from us moving forward. I'll pass it over now to the Secretariat to move on to our next panel. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you, Kevin, and all the speakers, Prof. Iwon Aziz, Prof. Jeffrey Frankel, and Montek Ahluwalia. And then now we will proceed to the last session of the webinar, which is the second panel on the climate transition implication on business and financial sector. This session will also last around an hour, and I would like to invite Dr. Reza Siregar, T20 Task Force of International Finance and Economic Recovery Co-Chair, and also the moderator for the next session. Reza Yamora Siregar is the head or senior executive vice president at the IFG Progress, and his research interest covers open and development macroeconomics, monetary economics, international finance, and trade and applied time series economics. Reza Siregar held many notable positions in the past, including as the chief representative of the Singapore office at the Institute of International Finance, executive director, chief Asian economist at Goldman Sachs Singapore, senior economist at the International Monetary Fund, and lead economist at the Asian Plus 3 Macroeconomic Research Office Singapore. Currently, Reza Siregar is also serving in several capacities, notably being a special advisor to the coordinating minister for economic affairs, faculty member at the Bank Indonesia Institute, adjunct faculty of the Asian Public Policy Program at Ito Subasio University, as well as a senior financial sector advisor at Australian-Indonesian Partnership for Economic Development, or Prospera. So without further ado, over to you, Pak Reza.
Terima kasih, Rifki. Again, good evening, morning, and afternoon for our panelists and participants for this webinar on the green economy for the Task Force 7 of the T20. It is my great pleasure moderating this, and I think we have heard the first 2 sessions pretty much mentioning about financial needs to transitioning into this green economy. We had just completed 2-day sessions of non-bank financial institutions issue in Indonesia a couple of days ago, and one of the sessions that we had was actually on the issue of digital economy and transition into green economy. Now again, the talks there was opened by a number of ministers, and they keep repeating also the issue of financing. Not only financing in terms of the size of financing, but also in terms of the long-term financing that we need. I think a number of colleagues in that meeting also reminded us that not only that we need to commit to the financing from the beginning to have it credible, but also we need to sustain the financing process itself. So it is going to be a long-term financing process. As you know, commitment to Paris Agreement continue all the way until 2050, 2060 for some of us. So that is at least another 20, 30 years or even longer, should there be any delays on this move into the green economy. At the same time, we also spoke during that conference and many of the discussions that we have on the Task Force International Finance or Task Force 7 of the T20 on the issue of, again, it was mentioned before in among the experts of extreme academics that we just heard, the issue of what are the green investment or green instrument or green asset or green financing. How do we define that? Again, I think we had some proposal from the European Union, and we also had some proposal from I think China on this. But again, international standard on what is considered to be green asset, in my understanding, has not been fully accepted or at least endorsed. So this is another issue that is also facing us in terms of what are considered to be green instrument where we can invest and finance and use that as a financing for this long-term investment. So here I'm quite we are quite fortunate that we have a group of a mix of market, multilateral, and some part of business associations and NGOs that are that are participating on this panel. And let me just do the following, please. Can I allow the first two speakers? First, let me allow Ms. Fiona Stewart, lead financial sector specialist at the World Bank, to start the discussions. And then I will ask Ibu Nurdiana Darus, who is also a deputy chair of our B20 Indonesia, and also with the head of corporate affairs at the Unilever of Indonesia. And then I will ask my colleague Rajiv Batra from JP Morgan as the third speaker on this one. And last but not least, Pak Agus Sari as the CEO of Landscape Indonesia to close the discussions. So Ibu Fiona, you have 6 to 10 minutes. The time is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Reza, and great to see everyone today. So I was asked to look at 3 questions, really. What are the challenges around this transition concept for the private sector and the financial sector? Secondly, what sort of coordination do we need to get there in terms of managing the financial, the market, the business risks? And thirdly, what would a smooth transition to the green economy, what would that mean? What would that look like? So if I run through those quickly, on the challenges, so we work with emerging markets, obviously at the World Bank. Our clients are in more developing economies. And honestly, I think the first challenge is that the whole concept of transition is very, very new. So a lot of the countries that we work in, they've done a good job on this environmental, social governance. And I'm speaking more from the financial side than the private sector side. The financial sector is more my background. But the ESG concept is there. So when we're looking at what, for example, listed companies are reporting, the governance is actually pretty strong. And the ESG concept is not bad, actually, is quite good. So we're working from a good foundation. TCFD. So climate reporting is coming on the radar. It's getting there. A lot more work to be done, but a lot of countries, regulators, and the companies themselves are starting to think about what they need to do to report on TCFD. Even some knowledge on the sustainability reporting, the ISSB international standards, people know these are on the horizon. Transition pathways, very, very new. And if you look at the, we were doing some work with the Climate Policy Initiative for the Coalition of Finance Ministers, which Indonesia is chairing. And from the financial institution side, there's about 500 institutions globally now coming out of my hometown, Glasgow, in the COP meeting last year. About 500 or so international banks, asset managers have said, we have a net zero plan, we want to have a transition plan. But 90% of those are in OECD countries, in the EU, in the UK, in the US. There's only a handful of financial institutions yet, few in Singapore, in Brazil, some in South Africa, who are starting to get to this concept. So the first challenge, I think, is to really make sure this concept is global and is understood. And the issue, the challenge with that, I think, will be very much capacity and data, and having the granularity of data and reporting to really put these transition plans in place and to do the benchmarking is going to be a big lift. And I think we're all going to have to sort of work on that sort of implementation. And also, I think, a risk around the bias that we have to think very carefully about these transition benchmarking, etc. It's set at the moment for OECD countries and companies. We have to make very sure that the transition pathways that we're putting in place really work for emerging markets, and that we're not trying to sort of force a transition plan onto countries that still have development plans. So that balance between the transition and development, we need to all think about, I think, very carefully. And overall, very supportive of this transition idea. We think actually it could be very helpful for emerging markets. There's been a lot of focus, I think, on the risk side of climate, but less on what the good plans that countries are putting in place in terms of adaptation and mitigation, etc. And thinking about this transition, which can give more, I think, of a customization by country, I think will be very positive. So, but I think we should all very clearly and very carefully think about what this means in an emerging market context. The second point, just on the sort of coordination. So absolutely, as mentioned, I think there's a lot of foundational pieces that are needed to put these transition plans in place. One certainly, as was just mentioned, is on the sort of taxonomy idea. Yes, there are some specific regional country taxonomies coming up. One thing that we're doing, working with our IMF colleagues, BIS colleagues for the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group, is looking at this idea of not necessarily harmonization. I think there can be nuances and customization by country, and also bring this transition concept into taxonomies is very interesting, which the ASEAN taxonomy has done, for example. But this interoperability, can we have at least sort of a minimum standard framework of the way that these taxonomies are put together that helps us come to sort of more of an understanding and a cross-country comparison, even if some of the scientific targets, etc., may be customized for the country. I think there's some framework that we can think about that can go across countries. The reporting frameworks, obviously, as I mentioned, the work of the TCFD, the International Sustainability Standard Boards, again, are very important. I think that will give us some more harmonization. And things like on the risk side, the risk measurement side, the good work that the NGFS, the Network for Greening the Financial System, and Co have done on risk scenarios for climate, and increasingly coming for nature, by the way, for biodiversity and nature degradation and loss, is a new area in the financial risk that we're looking at in terms of how do we make sure that's part of the transition conversation as well. They're starting to come together. So I think those sort of building blocks to allow us to do this coordination and to make these transition plans robust are starting to come together in terms of the international financial sector architecture. I think we also need to do some more work, by the way, on the macro modeling, because a lot of the feedback between the real sector and the financial sector is not well understood. So we do climate risk assessments for central banks as part of a financial sector assessment, our FSAP programs. And that looks at how, if you have a GDP shock, how that goes to the banking sector for non-performing loans, etc. But we don't think about how the financial sector then feeds back to the macro sector. So some of these interlocking transition, mechanisms, I think needs a lot more thought and work on the macro level as well. Also cascading of risks, tipping points. That leads me to my third point, which is on what do we need for a smooth transition to the green economy? And I will make sort of 2 points here. One is, I think we need to think really broadly on a whole of economy approach. And that's very much what we're trying to do at the bank, is think much more broadly and in a holistic way about how we need to green the whole approach of governments, of ministries of finance. And inside the bank, we're increasingly mainstreaming climate in all of our work, in all of our operations, including climate diagnostics, CCDRs for countries. And these idea of sort of policy packages, I think, are very important. So I know Indonesia is doing lots of very good work on the energy transition at the moment. And thinking of the policy package that we need to get there, it's not just a case of ramping up renewables. You have to change the whole of the energy grid in order to make that feasible, to make the transition work. We have to think about carbon pricing. We have to think about the social protection, the just transition mechanisms that are in place. So these policy packages, I think, is very important to think more holistically if we're going to make this transition smooth. And the sort of country platform approach that the G20 and others are talking about, I know, again, Indonesia is working on, our South African colleagues are working on for their energy transition, this sort of country platform approach, working on a holistic basis, thinking about the policy package and working with the public and the private sector. I think some very interesting work going on around country platforms. I'm sure some of the audience are involved in those and in those conversations. And then finally, I would just say for the smooth transition, again, to really think about the unintended consequences for emerging markets and making sure we really have the implementation support for emerging markets in place. That can be making sure that we don't have any of these inherent sort of income biases in things like the benchmarking that I mentioned for the transition. We might need to have, I say, a lot more support as we roll out the reporting, the sustainability reporting. And one other interesting idea I'll just leave with, I think, is on the instruments to get there too. We need to think about what are the right instruments, financial instruments. We're doing quite a lot of work on moving from the idea of green bonds, labeled bonds in terms of use of proceeds, ring fencing for renewable or transport projects, to the sustainability linked, the idea of having performance related instruments that pay out according to actually meeting targets and really pushing ambition. So I think there's some interesting new innovation and new products on the financial sector coming through. So let me leave it there, but lots of challenges, but I think lots of opportunities, and really taking a holistic approach is what we're going to be needed to really move to the next level. Thank you.
Thank you, Fiona. Thank you very much. Can I ask Ibu Nudiana Dairus, please? Thank you.
Thank you, Pak Reza. Good evening and good morning, fellow panelists. The question is, how could businesses take part and invest in a low carbon transition? The world is indeed experiencing far greater impacts from climate change faster than predicted. The window for us to decarbonize and limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial level is rapidly closing, and the time for businesses to commit to net zero is now. As part of the B20 Indonesia Women in Business Action Council, I am Deputy Chair, but I am also the Corporate Affairs and Sustainability Director of Unilever Indonesia. Today, I will present as an example of how Unilever has committed itself to a climate transition plan. And I will then, I would start by briefly sharing about our business in Indonesia. Next slide, please. We have 43 brands and 9 factories in Indonesia, and we directly employ over 4,900 employees. Now, to reach our consumers in all parts of Indonesia, in which every household nationwide use at least one of our products, we have several distribution centers in several locations and deploy around 3,000 trucks per day within our supply chain. This totals to just below 21,000 tons of CO2 equivalent emissions annually from our own manufacturing and distribution in Indonesia. For every Unilever product that you have in your house, and I hope that you have at least one Unilever products in your house, there is a carbon footprint embedded in it. Our aim is for you to still enjoy our products while being assured that your loved brands have zero carbon footprint. Now, the climate crisis has far too long been misunderstood as a future environmental crisis, while in fact, without a doubt, it is a socioeconomic crisis impacting millions of people right now, and we all know this. The climate change impacts commodity harvest, availability of clean water, and increasing the occurrences of life-threatening extreme weather events. Not only that, this means millions of people are affected every day, especially the vulnerable ones, but this crisis has also amplified the fluctuations in commodity prices, which we are already seeing, and therefore have major implications on profit margins for businesses such as ours. We also see that the environmental footprints of emerging and developing countries are increasing as their economies expand. Improving resource security and efficiency is key for any businesses. Now, without decisive action and collaborations on a global scale by the private sectors, governments, and consumers, climate change is perhaps the biggest risk to our business. At Unilever, we see that businesses which fall behind on this transition risk being outmaneuvered by adaptive and purpose-led businesses, limiting them to access to finance, customers, and talent in the process. Now, with that in mind, we established the Unilever Compass as our North Star in navigating our business sustainably. Our compass emphasizes on 3 pillars: improve the health of the planet, improve people's health and confidence and well-being, and contribute to a fairer, more socially inclusive world. As part of our commitment to improve the health of the planet, our Climate Transition Action Plan, or CTAP, sets out the steps for the company will take to reduce emissions to zero within our own operations by 2030 and to net zero across our value chain by 2039. Now, this is 11 years ahead of the 2050 deadline outlined in the Paris Agreement. Our strategy is based on climate science and aims to transform our own operations, as well as supporting systematic change beyond our business. Now, given that we expect emission to be priced by governments through various instruments, including financial instruments, we believe that prompt actions to drive aggressive reductions in emissions today will lead to a more competitive business overall in the future. To reach our goals, we have outlined our path with milestones, and we classify the emissions to 3 scopes, which translates to Scope 1, direct on-site emissions, such as through shifts from natural gas, fossil fuel-based energy to biomass in our factories. Scope 2 includes indirect on-site emissions through use of and purchase of renewable energy certificates. And Scope 3 includes upstreams and downstream emissions reductions in the value chain that is outside of our own operations, for example, through empowering our farmers and our suppliers. Now, the Unilever CTAP is a stepwise approach that would allow us to arrive at net zero by 2039. Our first ambition is to eliminate emissions from our own operations. This is a small share of our value chain emissions, but represents those that we have direct control. So what have we achieved so far within our own operations? In Indonesia, we have reached 85% emission reduction within our operations. In 2020, we have achieved 100% renewable grid electricity target globally. Now our focus is to transition to renewable heat sources, increase energy efficiency, and reduce refrigeration emissions. By 2020, we have also sustainably sourced 99.6% of our core volumes of palm oil and palm kernel oil. We are also transitioning our plastic packaging to recycled packaging. Some of our brands in Indonesia, such as Bango, Rinso, Molto, Weepol, and Sunlight, are already using 100% recycled plastic bottles, with other brands following the lead. Our biggest chunk of the total emission is through Scope 3, which involves our supply chain partners. In 2021, we launched the Climate Program to support and coordinate with a pilot of 300 prioritized suppliers out of our 56 suppliers globally, for them to publicly announce a target of halving absolute GHG emissions by 2030 and share their journey publicly. This will help our suppliers develop tangible implementation plans as well as reporting, while at the same time reducing financial risk, market risk, and business risk for them to be on this climate transition. We are promoting climate smart agriculture to all our farmers on all our commodities such as black soybean, dwarf coconut, and palm oil. Farming is, of course, responsible for 20% of all GHG emissions worldwide. Thus, we need to ensure that our farmers have the capacity, the capability, and also the resiliency to adapt to climate change. We would also ensure they have sustainable livelihoods. For us to achieve a smooth transitions towards a green economy, we've identified 3 calls to actions for businesses, governments, and the financial sector. First, businesses globally must create their net zero roadmaps, work jointly with their partners and across their value chain to collectively drive lower levels of GHG emissions, and also advocate to their countries and the governments they operate in to strengthen their emissions reduction plans. Second, the government should create a harmonized road to zero roadmap and policies across sectors, including financial incentives for pioneering businesses that have embarked on this transition. The government should engage the private sector on a phased approach to net zero. The Indonesia's Ministry of Environment and Forestry Regulation 75/2019 on roadmap for waste reduction by producers is actually a good example of that. Lastly, the financial sector should accelerate green investments for businesses to engage in strategic repositioning, pursuing large-scale green innovations, and building the right capability. For example, Unilever Indonesia has a pilot plastic recycling facility in Sidoarjo, our Kresoft plant, that has technically been proven to deliver recycled resin and back into packaging. This is a novice technology that requires support for green investments to assist it in scaling up. In closing, Unilever has great ambitions to achieve net zero by 2039. However, only with collaborations with governments, other companies, and the financial sector that we can only collectively support the country's target to reach net zero by 2060. Thank you, Pak Reza.
Thank you. Again, your presentations keep me thinking about the potential role of the business player,
yes,
actually to take and lead this transitioning into the green economy. So I'll come back to that questions to you maybe toward the end.
Yes.
Now, may I ask Rajiv to please give you some thoughts on this one? Rajiv, the time is yours.
Thank you, Pak Reza. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. So climate change mitigation has long been viewed as gradual process, allowing carbon-intensive economies to gradually reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. But the climate urgency is now clear, and according to United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, urgent action is needed if catastrophic climate change is to be avoided. According to the Swiss RE Institute, 15% of the global GDP could be lost over the next 30 years if no action is taken. But if there is scale and pace of transformation, the quick transition to carbon neutral economy is done, it can also lead to unprecedented voluntary economic shock. Some factories will have to close, employees will have to be reassigned to the other professions, investment will have to increase in order to adapt or rebuild the capital stock. These implications have to be systematically addressed. As an example, small changes over the next 10-year horizon can hide large disruptions along the way. Of course, the macroeconomic consequences of climate action are difficult to pin down, as it involves a set of regulations, subsidies, incentives, border measures, public spending, and taxes. However, decarbonization is fundamentally about putting a price on a resource that was previously free. This price can be explicit by taxation or implicit by regulation. But the two types of measure have the same effect of triggering an accelerated obsolescence of the existing capital stock. Decarbonization can therefore be seen as a negative supply shock, like the oil shocks of 1970. In the short term, at least it will inevitably have a negative effect on potential output. This does not necessarily mean the growth will decline, except in the cases or country where the output gap is already fully closed, as carbon pricing will, remember, trigger research spending, new infrastructure spending, accelerated renewal of equipment and resources, investment in the renovations of the building, but the makeup of growth will change. As more resources are spent on investment and less on consumption. Without a doubt, consumers will be better off in the long run because they will benefit from a safe climate, but in the short term, their well-being may suffer at least compared to the trend. Public finances also will be affected as the carbon taxes is regressive as opposed to progressive, as carbon taxes disproportionately impact the lower income compared to upper income or upper middle class. Many governments are likely to try to mitigate its effects on the most vulnerable household. So instead of providing the means to reduce other taxes and increase potential output accordingly, revenues will have to finance transfer. Further transfer will also be needed to offset the consequences of stricter regulation for cars, for example, or home heating system. Public investment in research, infrastructure, and building innovation will be necessary. The net impact on the public budget is likely to be negative. Even leaving out many other dimensions of the question, such as the extent of stranded assets or the consequences of decarbonization on international trade and exchange rate, a simple exploration of the essential mechanism at play suggests that transition to net zero carbon will face serious macroeconomic challenges for policymakers. Now, I'm being equity strategist. Let's see what is happening in the world of asset managers and asset owners. So green economy transformation or climate change is the key ESG topic for asset owner as they seek asset manager which could help them estimate carbon footprint from the investment. Asset owners are also increasingly looking for fund relationship to help them offset carbon footprint and reach climate commitment alongside carbon trading, which helps in the transition. About 70% of the asset allocators have taken ESG into consideration versus 50% 3 years ago, based on our recent conversation with the global fund managers. Over the last couple of years, development has seen amongst asset allocators as they recruited dedicated responsible investment teams, which help them trickle down in demonstrate risk-adjusted return in particular certain environmental friendly portfolio kind of environment. Nonetheless, most of the asset owners are still prioritizing returns, with only handful of them mandating environment impact as the primary objective over the returns. These are mostly your family-owned offices, which hold strong value stem from their philanthropic activity. But we do expect similar mandates are expected to grow in the future, which means environmental analysis needs to be blended with the fundamental research. Research firm needs to have an ESG rating system to assist fundamental analysts. During fund review process, the head of houses or asset classes would go through or would need to look into the portfolio into granular detail to see how assessment is built into the investment process. Fund managers should also be evaluated on their ESG engagement initiative. In short, we need to see what a slow pace, the shift in nature of investing happening, that should gather the pace. The traditional way of looking at fundamental bottom-up factor needs to evolve, and it should start incorporating ESG, which takes into account negative externality and could be reflected over time in the cost of capital and revenue stream. But like most of the cases, one of the key challenges sustainable investment is facing is the short-term trade-off. So when green economy favors sector like electric vehicles, renewable, etc. are underperforming year to date versus oil, energy, commodities, fossil fuel, which has surged this year, it is important for managers to take long-term approach. To conclude, climate transition plan is essential and urgent. In the longer term, the emergence of efficient low carbon or completely neutral technologies offer good reason for enlightened optimism about the economic consequences of the ecological transition. Although this is not certain, it is increasingly likely that if the challenges of international collective actions are overcome, the transition to net zero carbon can be achieved in the longer term without a major drop in the living standard. Not transitioning would bring two types of injustice. Number one, towards future generation, and number two, towards poor countries and communities which disproportionately bear the cost of pollution. We have heard even the previous panel about the new energy, but new energy reality brings new challenges. Number one, balancing near-term fossil fuel development and fossil fuel lock-in by future-proofing assets. Number two, balancing the rise of energy and commodity independence and energy interdependence. Number three, balancing unrealistic expectation and limitation of climate innovation on corporate and sovereign mitigation efforts. And number four, balancing impossible decarbonization figure with more reasonable estimate which account for the creation of new market and cost savings achieved via a clean energy transition. Number five, balancing a climate fatalism versus optimism mindset in the face of climate realism. With that, let me take a pause and hand it back to Parita.
Thank you very much, Rajiv. Again, there's a lot of things on the tables that you put here. Coming from I agree with you, the issue of macro challenge, and then you bring it into the asset allocations. And I want to come back to this one, Rajiv. And I think again, the issue is that I agree with you. The issue on the short run is going to be the challenge, and this transitioning in the short run. And the impact on macro on the short run and on the equity and asset allocation is something that I'll come back to you after the presentations. Now, let me go to Pak Agus. Pak Agus, can you please give your perspective again from your experience at the various agencies that you have been with on this issue of impact of green transition into business and finance. Silakan Pak, terima kasih.
Terima kasih banyak Pak Reza. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, morning or everything in between to everybody who's in other parts of the world. I'd like to start with the quote from the Secretary General of the United Nations when the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, released the first of the series of 3 reports that the IPCC released in 2021 and 22. He basically said, the report shows a code red for humanity. How that basically shows how dire the situation is. And many of us would say, let's adapt to climate change. We can adapt to it, right? It's only a couple of degrees warmer than today. Unfortunately, the second report shows that the changes will be much faster than our capability to adapt. How long would you expect a forest to reappear in a barren land? How many years do you expect hydrological infrastructure be built in a very, very vulnerable places, right? Look at the impacts of heat waves in India and Pakistan now, and how much it's basically costs people's lives, let alone their economies. There are about 1,000 large floods last year alone in various places in Kalimantan. Trillion tons of permanent ice is melting in the North Poles every year, adding volume to seawater that leads to increased sea level that affects low-lying cities. And it just affected Semarang probably in the past couple of weeks. A team of MIT that published the seminal book, The Limits to Growth, put together a report that shows that the society is on the right track for a global collapse as early as 2040. So the good news is, however, is the third report of the IPCC, which I happen to be a lead author of, says that we actually know what to do. We have the means to do it, but we need to act now. Kevin Gallagher earlier today says, basically it is now or never. So that's what we need to do. Fortunately, we have Paris Agreement, but unfortunately, we have more than Paris Agreement to be able to achieve the Paris Agreement's objective to keep temperature increase to 2 degrees Celsius, let alone 1.5. So we may even need 2 Paris Agreements to achieve one Paris Agreement's objective. What needs to be done basically is that we need to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases greatly. We need to peak emissions by 2030. That's 8 years from today, and reduce it to net zero by mid-century, and to continue decreasing it to an absolute zero emissions before the end of the century. What does this mean? What does this mean? First is that countries around the world will tighten regulations on greenhouse gas emissions. Indonesia, for example, has committed to limiting its emissions at 29% below its otherwise business as usual trajectory in 2030 with own resources, and extend it to 41% when international financial cooperation is made available. It is also committed to achieving net zero emissions by 2060 or earlier, and turning its forestry sector to become a net sink by 2030. Now, Indonesia has put together law number 7 of 2021 on harmonization of taxation regulations that for the first time in Indonesia's history includes carbon tax. It, of course, started with a very, very low price of $2 per ton, but it will increase once the value of carbon is realized in Indonesia as well as all over the world, and carbon market is mature. And a study actually shows that soon enough the carbon price will probably increase to about $50 to $100. Mari says it's not going to happen tomorrow, but it will happen eventually. Now, coal-fired power plants will be regulated first by the law. Originally, it was to start in April of 2022, but it will possibly start in July or even August of 2022. Other sectors obviously will follow suit very soon. The president of Indonesia, Pak Jokowi, upon returning from the G20 summit in Rome and the COP26 of the UNFCCC in Glasgow, basically immediately assembled his cabinet and summoned the 2 main state-owned energy companies, telling them that transition to low carbon cannot be delayed. Phasing out or phasing down, using the language of the UNFCCC, of coal use is to be accelerated. So that's his political commitment down there. So these are quite an ambitious series of commitments. What does it mean to businesses and financial institutions and the economy in general? I don't remember. I think it was Rajiv probably told everybody that the first risk would be stranded assets. As governments tighten the regulations on carbon is going to be a greater liability now, and increasingly so in the near future. Then when, for example, decisions for financing of such assets, such pipelines were made. So bottom lines need to be recalculated. And, who knows whether some of them would actually show more liabilities than they are assets. So these are going to happen. There are, of course, ways to manage risks, as they are liabilities. Carbon and other greenhouse gas emissions are also assets when you can reduce them, when we can put value on carbon. Presidential Regulation number 98 of 2021, for example, in Indonesia, treats carbon to have economic and, as such, of course, financial values. In addition to tax and levies, carbon can be traded, similar with other commodities or securities, with other and also other assets. These assets can be used to manage the carbon liabilities of companies. So, the regulations will be stricter over time. The carbon liabilities will be increasing over time, but we know enough now to how to manage the transition, and we know how to manage the economy towards net zero and absolute zero carbon economy. Businesses will need to embrace low carbon assets and let go of the carbon intensive assets. That's that goes without saying. It's already happening right now. More than 1,500 institutions right now, with total assets under management close to $40.5 trillion, have divested from carbon intensive assets. BlackRock is one of them, one if not the largest asset management company, with assets under management of more than $8.5 trillion, has announced last year that it would sell most of its shares in fossil fuel producers. They corrected it earlier this year and continue to hold about $85 billion worth of fossil fuel assets. But everybody is going towards that direction. In Indonesia, Bank Negara Indonesia (BNI) has been under continuous attack from financing coal projects by the community and the NGOs. But very recently, Bank Rakyat Indonesia (BRI), Indonesia's largest bank with about $11 billion worth of assets under management, has just recently announced that they stopped financing coal and oil projects. So they know that this is a liability. Indonesia's presidency of the G20 is a golden momentum, and we need to use this. G20 is a group of the largest economies of the world. Pak Bambang Brojo Negoro earlier today says that Indonesia welcomes financial cooperation with developed countries to achieve our climate targets, including our net zero targets. We have calculated, as a part of our study for the Ministry of National Development Planning, that Indonesia will be requiring about $200 billion of additional investment in the next to achieve net zero by 2060 from its business as usual trajectory. 200 billion more to accelerate it to 2050 from 2060, and 200 more from 2050 to 2045. The additional investments are expected actually to lead better economy for Indonesia. It will lead to higher GDP growth, 6.4% instead of 6%, higher per capita income, and 5% lower unemployment. I like Bu Mari, and I think Fiona mentioned about this just transition. There are sectors who would lose in this transition, and there are sectors who would win. But fortunately, though, the winners are bigger than the losers. And if we could put together a mechanism for just transition, everybody wins. Now, Ibu Mari asked, where is the money from? Where can we find it? Now, we have different sources of financing, and the question is, where from? And my answer would be from everywhere. Basically, just make use of every single source of financing, public and philanthropic, as well as commercial investments, public and private investment financing. All of those and they have different risk appetites. And I think our task right now is to increase our ability to blend them in the right concoction, to be able to reallocate risks and de-risk the investment according to the investment profiles. So just to close, investment opportunity is sizable in the effort for climate transition. It is an opportunity to forge mutually beneficial investment cooperation with other members of G20, and we need to make sure that we can see the opportunities in the upcoming G20 summit in facilitating our global as well as national low carbon development. Pak Reza, terima kasih banyak. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Terima kasih, Pak Agus. I'm afraid I'm not going to do any justice to this group of panelists. There's so many issues, and we could basically take every one of these as one full session itself, and obviously we don't have that we cannot afford the time, and at least not today. So let me just try to summarize and put 3 or 4 major questions to all the panelists. Again, I'm sorry if I try to make it too general for you guys, but I think, and I'm looking at also some of the questions from the floor. They share your concern, basically. They share the concern of risk. They share the concern of what could be the challenge. But I think if I were to sum up, the big picture is that I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I think the key word is transitioning, right? We are not moving directly. We are transitioning into the green economy. I think that's the first things that seems to be come up in terms of the theme from your views or your statement. But the challenge obviously is, how do we transitioning and how long can we sustain it, right? Or we are going to be borrowing some of your points, is that we are going to be broken before we are actually successful in our transitioning into the green economy. So the first set of questions is, this is again a mix from the first speaker, Fiona, and also I think Rajiv well spoken about this, and as well Pak Agus, is on the issue of obviously the of macro financial linkages. Right? There's a lot of macro challenge that will have an impact on the financial market and will feed back into the macroeconomy. I want to ask you one simple question here. For instance, in the case of our economy, 60% of our energy is still based on coal. Right? And I think this is the challenge for us when we talk about financing and generating green financing, dealing with the fact that most of our sector, or most of our key sector of the economy, are still based on non-renewable. Right? So the transiting into that is quite challenging in terms of the current industry itself, and this is what Rajiv is saying in terms of the short run potential destabilization from this effort. But another thing also that I want to ask on this one is basically, I think Pak Agus, this is coming from your presentation, Pak, but this is I want to share to anyone who wants to answer this. If we are forcing the move into green asset, yeah, in terms of green economic activities. So let me not put green asset, I put green economic activities. Should we be concerned in terms of if we move that at the same time, yeah, and at a very sizable amount of money, are we creating a potential bubble in some of this industry? And that will eventually also create destabilizing. So again, we did a simple calculation, for instance. In the case of Indonesia, bond outstanding that can be considered as green is only less than 3% of GDP. Yeah, so I'm just concerned in terms of, again, this is the issue that Diana was talking also about the macro financial linkages. how do we see this as potential risk as well? And maybe this is something also that Rajiv was also talking about. So that's one question to me. It's basically how do we transitioning this into this green asset without creating too much of destabilizing in the micro financial linkages. The second issue that I want to touch on this one is basically, again, there has been talk about both in terms of the business side and also in terms of the country side, and I think there's also a question from the floor, from the online participations, is that we recognize the need to have a country by country specific customerizations. We recognize that we may not, I think Fiona coined the terms, the need to have a minimum standard at the very least. But at the same time, we also have a international target of 2030, 2050, and 2060 for some of us. So how do we balance that? Right? And especially, how do we make sure that when we are doing that, when we are trying to customize or trying to basically have some country specifics, allowing some country specific adjustment or transitioning, we are not being penalized. And this is especially for the emerging market. Is there any thought on this one? The third question is basically, again, I think this is mostly coming from Ibu Nurdiana. Again, I met many of colleagues from the business sector, Ibu, and there seems to be a lot more progressive in terms of moving into this green economy transitioning. My question is that, is there any, do you find any on your business B20 or your activity at your firms, sense that the business can actually pushing this faster than what the governments or the national levels? And this is something that we may want to also, at least for instance, in my case, when I'm part of the Minister of Coordinating Economic Affairs, we are trying to look at how much is the business is also able to push faster than what we can do among the policymakers or the national level. So in terms of roadmaps, you mentioned, for instance, about the supply chains partnership. Can you give us a bit of that, please? Now, last but not least, again, I pick at your CV, Fiona. You are advising, you're also a financial advisor on the non-bank financial institutions. What are the role of these institutions? You know, there's a pension, there's insurance, because there's a lot of risk mitigation going on here. There's a big financing needed, and many of our emerging markets are needing also this this type of institution development. Can you see the role of this institution in helping us in mitigating this cost of financing and also risk moving into the green economy? So let me just stop there, and I'm posting some of these questions. Again, anyone feel free to take any to approach on this. So let me just start from the sequence that I started with. Can I ask Fiona to do this, please? Again, we need to do this all within 10 minutes, please. Thank you.
Sure. Oh, gosh, lots of questions in there. The last one first. Yes, yeah. Pension funds, hugely important, long-term capital that we need. I think the concept of blended finance, making sure we have the instruments that really meet they are there to pay our pensions, but the blended finance that gives them the risk, the return kind of instruments that they need to be able to deploy this long-term capital. They have a very important role. We need the players all to come together. On the sort of energy transition, the transition pathways, I think we're just starting to think about this for emerging markets, a lot more work to do. In terms of the sequencing, the electrification of the economy is key. We have to get the energy sector right before we can then work on the low carbon transport industry, households, etc. That's a sequencing that's absolutely key. I think we can separate out a little bit the coal decommissioning, which is difficult for that sector, but I think there's definitely a global role here. Some of the good initiatives coming out of the G20, the South Africa, the Indonesia platforms, the international community, I think, has a role to really help the countries and this sector in particular. I think that's slightly different from, say, the gas, which I think the EU and others recognize as a transition fuel, which certainly at the bank we consider, if there's no other renewable immediate option, to consider still using gas, but think of it very much as a transition, as a medium-term option. But I think this whole sector has to come first. And on the macro side, again, I think a lot more work to do. We've gone almost from like we like to say, an unknown unknown to a known unknown. We now know this is a financial risk. We now know we have to take it into consideration in the financial stability. We know the models aren't perfect, but I think there's a lot of work being done to think about these transmission mechanisms and to improve the tipping points, the cascade, etc. We're bringing them in going forward. So I think the modeling tools, the analysis that we have will improve going forward. But let me hand over to others to answer some of the other questions.
Thank you, Ibu Nurdiana.
Yes, Bapak. Thank you, Pak Reza. Your question on how can the business push faster than the national level? Now, as I presented before, we as a business, we look at our own operations first, and then in parallel, get our supply chain partners to transition with us. However, it does need to be supported by the government and also the financial sector. Much of this transition to green economy does involve innovations that does need to be financed and needs to be de-risked as well. And innovations can only go up so much before then it does need to be scaled up before it can really be amplified and the impact of it can be felt by the wider society. So a lot of that we can start on our own initially, but does need to be supported, especially by the government and the financial sector. Now, there are risks and there are opportunities, and I mentioned before, the opportunities are clear. You know, in order for us to curb the prices of commodities and the fluctuations in the price of commodities, we need to do something about that. Before we think about everyone else, we think about, you know, how do we keep our profit margins at a healthy level? And of course, you know, cost is a big portion of it that we need to keep at bay. And then, of course, our consumers are starting to demand more sustainable products that we use. And our consumers, as an FMCG, our consumers really do drive the way that we move forward with our business. And we always need to be future fitting our business. Also, not just the business, but also the talent that we get into the business as well. And the future fitting our business with the millennials as they move into companies such as ours. They want to make sure that they join companies that are purpose-led and future fitting, that are also relevant and are concerned for their well-being and their future in generations to come. I hope that answers your question, Pak.
Thank you. There obviously there are a lot more that we can discuss on this.
Yes.
Pak Rajiv, you want to say something on the issue that we floor? Thank you.
Thank you, Pa. So, Pa, answering your question, what is needed in longer term? I believe we need emergence of efficient, low carbon or completely neutral technology, which can help in managing the economic consequences of this climate transition. That's number one. Number two, we need more credit to be given to the lower income communities and countries, which will be critical to make sure that they benefit from the green technologies, particularly from the developed market nation or G7. So if there is a international collective action to overcome this, then transition to net zero carbon can be achieved in the longer term without a major drop in living standard or impacting the fabric of low income population. Now, what we are seeing currently, if we try to fasten it up, we are already seeing an impact, and that is with the oil prices. Year of underinvestment in the oil sector have exacerbated oil supply shortages. At the same time, renewable energy is limited by supply chain constraint, bottleneck infrastructure, and mineral supply chain inflation. And top of it, this Russia-Ukraine tension coalition between green ambition and energy security is possibly now sidelining green power transition in some DM markets also by good 5 to 10 years. So 4 factors which are clearly impacting world or a clean energy outlook right now is availability, affordability, security, and sustainability. Hence, we need to be super careful between the pace of transition. Talking about asset allocation, yes, short term it becomes a concern, but that's where fund managers, either on equity, credit, or on the banking side, need to be careful. They need to take this transition as a longer term phenomena, not one short term trade off. Because the question which I commonly face is whether one can generate alpha in the ESG or sustainable investment. Yes, if you are looking from medium term to longer term perspective, rather than you are looking from a short term perspective. The problem is people take ESG more as a philosophical view of reviewing it rather than taking it as an empirical approach. So different ESG issue impact a company's share performance over different time horizon, and investors should focus on the most relevant factor and not be distracted by material issue. By that way, even it will help to navigate the short term and the medium term impact. So that's it from my side.
Terima kasih Pak Rajiv. That's very good advice. Pak Agus, can you bring it home, please? Thank you.
Thank you, Reza. Will it be a bubble? Let me see it this way. First is that the underlying reasons for the transition is solid, yeah, and the cost of not doing it is exorbitant. So indeed, we thought we had a choice, but we actually don't. And also, renewable energy, in many cases, is already cheaper than even coal. Yeah, I think it was then Deputy CEO of PLN. Now is the CEO of PLN that says that without the battery, actually solar panel is cheaper than coal already. And among the coal-fired power plants, a lot of them are already too expensive to operate competitively because they are just too old. Early decommissioning of these plants actually makes so much economic and financial sense. Already, the Asian Development Bank has put together an energy transition mechanism in Southeast Asia that would actually provide, financial assistance to accelerate, to speed up the phase out of coal. South Africa has already put together an $8 billion fund for phasing out coal. So the key word is transition. Yeah, like what you said, Reza. We are not forcing it immediately. We're not doing it tomorrow. We are doing it in a period of time. We have, of course, the possibility to accelerate. So what we need to do now is a narrative. The transition brings positive impacts on the economy, and as such, it is a business case. It is, a low carbon is a good business. That's the narrative that we need to all believe in. The transition also brings positive local impacts. Jakarta, half of Jakarta's air pollution comes from the coal power plants surrounding it. 22 of them, on average, about between 500 to 1,000 megawatts. So just imagine if all of that is no longer there, then Jakarta is already way better and much more livable. I hope that helps, Reza. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, everyone. Let me refrain myself from posting more questions as much as I want to. Again, I want to thank you, Ibu Fiona, Ibu Nurdiana, Pak Rajiv, and Pak Agus. And let me give the floor to the Secretariat. Thank you very much, everyone.
Okay, thank you, Pak Reza, Bu Fiona, Bu Nurdiana, Pak Agus, and Pak Rajiv for a very fruitful and valuable talks and insight. And this brings us to the end of the this evening's event. On behalf of the lead co-chair of Task Force 7 of T20 Indonesia, Pak Ati Basri, and all the organizing committee, I would like to thank everyone for your great enthusiasm and engagement throughout this event. If you are missing the earlier part of this event, the recording of this event will be available from the T20 and LPM YouTube channel. We also invite you to follow our social media on Twitter at T20 Solutions, on LinkedIn, and our YouTube, and keep us engaged with your thoughts, concerns, and ideas for the betterment of T20 contribution to the G20 Indonesia's agenda. Recover together, recover stronger. My name is Teguh Rifki, and on behalf of the team and everyone involved in this program, we are looking forward to having you again in our incoming T20 events throughout the year. Until then, please stay safe and stay healthy. Goodbye and see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you.